seat of Bennelong. Polling booths have just closed in what has become a tight race. I'm joined in the studio by Manager of Opposition Business, Tony Burke, and Liberals, Trent Zimmerman, the federal member for North Sydney, and the ABC's election analyst, Anthony Green. And of course, we'll be with you right throughout the evening, and we've got reporters in the field. Lucy Carter is at Labor's base for the night, which is in Ryde, and she joins us now. And Lucy, what's the feeling on the ground? You've been with Christina Keneally for the last week, really. What's the feeling from the Labor camp?
Well, certainly the Labor camp here is just setting up and getting, as you can see, the volunteers behind me are blowing up balloons and getting ready. But I'd say there's actually some quiet confidence here. I spoke to a volunteer here earlier and they said that what they're setting up is a dance floor. It is a 10% swing that Christina Keneally needs to overcome to take this seat from the Liberal candidate John Alexander. But they are very hopeful that she has the numbers to do it here tonight.
OK, Lucy, we'll cross back to you later throughout the evening. And Stephen Jedgetts is at the Liberal headquarters, which is also in Ryde. Stephen, you've been with John Alexander today. What sort of reception did he receive throughout the day?
Bridget, there was no hostility towards John Alexander, but there is something of a feeling in the electorate that there's some disappointment towards the Turnbull government. And whilst John Alexander certainly didn't cop any aggression from any voters, there was a sentiment amongst at least some of them that perhaps it was time for a change. But as Lucy said, a 10% swing, it's a mountain for Labor to climb. People here in the coalition camp, in the base here, say that they are a little bit nervous tonight. They do believe that John Alexander will hold on. They think there'll be a swing against him, but that it won't be sufficient to unseat him. Nonetheless, quite a few nerves here at Liberal HQ here tonight.
Stephen Jedgetts, thank you very much. Well, of course, as we mentioned, it's been an extremely tight race. There's been senior front benches from both sides on the campaign trail, and of course we've seen a lot of Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten. To get a sense of how things are going, let's first start with you, Tony Burke. I think, is a dance floor the right thing? Is there going to be lots of dancing at Christina Keneally's camp tonight?
Makes me particularly glad I'm here in the studio. When I was asked in, I thought, I wanted to be there, but now I'm very happy to be here.
So you don't think there's going to be dancing?
Well, there certainly won't be from me, which is in everyone's interest. But
you could do it here, Tony, I'm sure.
Look, when it was described before about a mountain to climb, that's an accurate description for us today. We have fought the by-election with the intention of winning it, but make no mistake that this is a big margin, and a by-election where the incumbent is a candidate makes it harder again. The normal rules about standard by-election swings sort of don't apply in a situation where the incumbent is also a candidate.
Trent Zimmerman, what are your sources telling you? You're in contact. I know the polling booths have just closed, but...
Well, it's been an interesting by-election campaign, I have to say, and some aspects of it have been quite disappointing. But I think it's going to be exceptionally close tonight. I think the electorate is far more volatile than it historically has been, and by-elections in particular are very volatile. But it's been interesting watching what's been happening on the booths today. A lot of our polling booth workers are reporting lower turnout than usual, but of course that's matched with a far higher early vote during the course of the last couple of weeks. So it'll be fascinating to see whether that has an impact.
Yeah, we've got the same information as that.
Yeah, right.
The turnout is down today. The other thing that I found, I was on the same booth as Scott Morrison this morning, and I'm not sure if it was the same for you, but I've never seen so many people refuse to take a how-to-vote card from anyone. When I saw they weren't taking them from Scott, I thought, good, but then they didn't take them from me either.
And what's that shown in the past, that their minds are made up, and does it normally, as you say, favour the incumbent?
Well, I think at 6 o'clock today, when we got there, everyone in Bennelong breathed a sigh of relief that no one was going to hassle them anymore.
I think it's a combination of both people having made up their mind, but also not wanting another piece of paper from a political party.
Well, and also there might be that sense of anger. It's 9 days till Christmas and they've been forced to go out and vote. I think it was 36 degrees today. It was a pretty hot day for them, so most of them, let's face it, probably prefer to be Christmas shopping.
Oh, yeah, the frustration. If you think what this period has been like, if you're an elector in that area, it's not simply every time you go to a shopping centre. It's not only every time you open your letterbox. when you're at home, I mean, they've been polled 12 times by different opinion polling companies. There's been a big robocall campaign that the Liberals have done, so you'll answer the phone
and a few
get...
from Labor and the unions as well, it's fair to say.
But you'll answer the phone and there's, a recorded voice talking at you. It's been impossible to be unaffected by the intensity of the campaign.
I know quite a few people that live in the electorate, and they've all said that they've never had so much campaign material that's come into their letterbox in any other election. If the polls are right, or some of the polls are right, and there is a 9% swing, what would that say about Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten?
Oh, if the swing is that big, and I'm in no way anticipating, if we get there, that's an extraordinary outcome tonight. But if it is that big, then I presume by the time we get to a next election, we're against a different Prime Minister. I don't see how Malcolm Turnbull would hold on if that were to happen.
Even if that swing... So Trent Zimmerman, if John Alexander holds the seat but there's such a large swing, what does it say?
I think a win is a win, and I think we'll take that. Because of the volatility in by-elections, to be able to hold a seat in what has been a difficult week for the Parliament generally, but the government tends to get the blame for what's happened over the last couple of months, particularly in relation to the citizenship saga, then I wouldn't be surprised if there is a big swing.
But if Christina Keneally gets over the line, what does that... Malcolm Turnbull's leadership under threat?
Let's cross that bridge when we get to it during the course of the evening.
I love that you said when.
Now let's go. We've also, of course, in the studio got the ABC's election analyst, Anthony Green. Anthony, now this isn't a normal by-election. Tony Burke mentioned it. It's a by-election they're normally held because, of course, the incumbent has quit. But this is a situation where, the incumbent obviously was forced to do this. So is it hard to compare this to normal by-elections?
Well, you don't have that annoyance by the electorate that they've been forced to a poll because somebody's resigned. And I remember the Ryan by-election when John Moore resigned after being dropped from cabinet. There was quite a lot of anger that they'd been forced to a by-election. I think so far we've seen 2 disqualification by-elections in the past, Jackie Kelly in 1996, and then with Barnaby Joyce. There were swings to the sitting member at the re-election. I wouldn't expect that here because the sitting members aren't usually that important in an urban electorate like this. So I think slightly different circumstances. But I think, as a general, I think nearly everybody who's going to get tossed out in the House on these citizenship issues is highly likely to get re-elected. So I think it's one of those things that there isn't that anger out there against sitting MPs who are popular because they've fallen foul of this provision. So I think we saw
that in New England.
The anger and annoyance is coming from citizenship fetishists on this issue, and that the anger and annoyance in the electorate isn't there at the by-elections we've seen of this type in the past. There will be a swing against the government this time, but it's going to be down to more general factors.
Okay. What do you think about that? The anger and annoyance, is it just to do with the citizenship saga, or do you think there's some anger and annoyance in general towards both parties, both sides?
on this, we'll each have a view that it's about the other. I suspect, and that's I don't want to spend tonight rerunning every single argument back and forth. But obviously, we've campaigned very strongly on the NBN. And campaigned strongly in terms of education and Medicare issues, particularly when the stories came out about tertiary education funding. This is one of the electorates with one of the highest rates of tertiary education in the country. This is a younger electorate than most parts of Australia. Not as ethnically diverse as my part of Sydney, but more ethnically diverse than most parts of Australia. So there's some particular factors for this seat. In terms of levels of anger, I've got to say, when I've been out in the electorate and the polling booth today was any guide, the dominant drive was not one of anger. The dominant drive was one of people having made their decision and wanting to complete this pathway. I think that's the best way to describe what I saw today.
What did you see, Trent? Do you agree with Tony?
I agree with that last point, that certainly today, as distinct from maybe a week ago where people were getting frustrated about being harassed and bombarded with material so much, that today they were just glad that the process was over. And there was certainly no hostility on the polling booth that I was at. But I think that what we've seen in this by-election, for me, is actually a worrying trend, and that is what I thought, to be frank, was some pretty despicable tactics, particularly in relation to the claims of xenophobia that was levelled against the Prime Minister, and they were so off the mark in terms of Malcolm Turnbull, who is one of the Parliament's greatest supporters of multiculturalism, and to see those type of tactics deployed, I think was very wrong.
I'm sure Tony Burke's also got some of his. It's been a reasonably personal campaign, I think, from both sides.
Yeah, it has been. And, you know, the Prime Minister claiming that Christina Keneally had Eddie Obeid in her cabinet, which was just plain wrong. You know, we can trade that sort of stuff during the course of the night. It won't make great TV, but we can do it if that's where we land. I do think something needs to be understood with respect to the Chinese community issues and the Korean community issues as well. No one should see, and who knows how that'll turn out in the vote tonight, who knows. But if anybody sees that as a phenomenon that has simply been driven by rhetoric over the last 2 weeks, then they've missed the point. The campaign that certainly we've been running in those particular communities, because last time round at the last federal election, there was a big campaign run particularly in those communities on the issue of marriage equality and safe schools, and we saw the Chinese community vote in larger numbers, possibly than ever before, in the seats like Bennelong, Reid and Banks for the Liberal Party. Since that time, we've had a fresh campaign on racial hate speech, on 18C, and the new citizenship laws. And a community that felt they had voted for the Liberal Party in bigger numbers than they ever had previously has felt, to varying extents, and no community is a monolith in terms of how they feel, but there is no doubt there's a sense from many people of betrayal, of policies coming forward, arguably since One Nation entered the Parliament, that were quite different to the expectations they'd been given at the last election. And that has provided fertile ground when people look, is there an anti-us element? There's very fertile ground there on this.
And I want to discuss more on that, and I'm going to come to Anthony in a minute just to talk about, we'll go through the electorate and changes there. But Treat, in terms of the Cory Bernardi vote and the Conservative vote, if there is a swing to Cory Bernardi, is this a rejection of the same-sex marriage laws, given that Bennelong had more people vote against same-sex marriage in the plebiscite than they voted for it?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I think that the Australian Conservatives ran a campaign across the electorate in quite strong terms. So they were at pre-poll and railway stations at every polling booth today. So they had a strong presence on the ground. Whether same-sex marriage, in light of the fact that it was following a decision taken by the Australian people themselves, really would have played out in that way, I'm not quite sure. But the other thing I think to remember is that the Australian Conservatives were predicting that they might get up to 20% tonight. I don't think that will be the case. And I think we also need to look very carefully at what happens to the Christian Democrat vote, who didn't run as strong a campaign as the Conservatives. At the last election, I think they got something like 6% of the primary vote. So it'll be interesting to see whether that simply moves across to the Australian Conservatives, because obviously their platform is very similar.
Yes. What do you think about the Conservative vote, Tony, and reasons behind it, the swing, if there is one?
My expectation, for viewers in other states, they won't be as familiar with the Christian Democrats, the Fred Nile vote, as people in New South Wales are. And effectively, I suspect we're going to see over time that vote that Fred Nile has commanded start to shift across to Cory Bernardi's party. And tonight will be the first big example of that. I'd be surprised if it's a more fundamental phenomenon than that, but I do think we'll see some of that happening. And if that happens, then we'll see the preference flow that we've seen for a long time, that particular vote overwhelmingly becomes a vote for the Liberal Party.
Yeah. Anthony, if we just take a look at Bennelong, it's a very different electorate to what it was decades ago, to one that John Howard represented. How different is it, in terms of geographic, socio-economic,
It's changed substantially. I'll just comment on the Christian Democrat first. He said they did get 6% last time, but their more traditional vote has been 2 to 2.5. They more than doubled it last time. Then in the local council elections early this year, they got 8% and 10% in the two wards they contested. They've tapped very strongly into Chinese Christian communities in that electorate, and the Christian Democrat vote has always been strong by getting out there and talking to the churches and getting the message, not in the polling place, but in the churches. And so that's always been their strength. So I'm completely... it was very difficult to pick them. The electorate has drifted westward for years ago. When John Howard first won it, he lived in Wollstonecraft, and Wollstonecraft was in the electorate. It was moved out of the next redistribution. John Howard didn't live in the electorate for the next 30 years, though everyone seems to think he did, but he didn't. The electorate shifted further west. It lost Lane Cove after the 1990 election, lost Hunters Hill at the 2001 election, which pushed it further out towards eastward, Ermington. It got Ermington in the last major change. This is much more socially mixed than what it used to be. Back in the 80s, it used to vote 10% above the state level of Liberal voting. By the 1990s, that was down to 7%, and in John Howard's election from 2004 to 2010, the Liberal vote in Bennelong was only 2% higher than the state vote. Now, some of that was... John Howard, for various historical reasons, did not have a good relationship with the Chinese community to do with going back to the 1980s and family reunion visas. And that sort of hung around him. But once he moved out of politics, much of that break that had occurred with the Chinese community, the State Liberal Party put huge effort into getting these natural business people voting for the Liberal Party. And we have seen a significant shift. It's interesting that the three areas with the big affluent Chinese communities, which is Hurstville, Strathfield and Eastwood in Sydney, they're in the federal electorates of Bennelong, Banks and Reid. Reid and Banks are currently Liberal held for the first time in their history, and Bennelong has become safer over the last two elections. So the Liberal Party hugely reconnected with the Chinese community after a number of years where they'd had difficulties.
And this is probably where I disagree with Anthony in relation to the impact of a local member. So, because I think that the work that JA has done within the Chinese community in Bennelong has been recognised by that community. And so, for example, if you look at the last election, some of the biggest swings towards the Liberal Party were in areas like Eastwood. So I think his personal vote has been very strong in those areas.
Yeah, and this is why I go to the marriage equality campaign that happened in this area last time. While John Alexander improved his vote election on election by 2% at the time, the exact same time there was a swing to Labor. You look at the big booths with high numbers of Chinese background voters, and his vote over the last two elections didn't improve by 2%, it improved by nearly 10%. Now, that campaign was very significant, and of the two issues I said that we've been campaigning on 18C, racial hate speech, there were three Liberals who were quite outspoken, expressing concern about what the government was doing, and they're in the three seats that Anthony just referred to. But on the citizenship laws, which do not underestimate how big an issue this has been in communities, none of them spoke out. And certainly I flagged this at the start. The response in both Chinese and Korean media during the course of this by-election campaign has been phenomenal on that issue. As I say, how it unfolds tonight, we're about to find out. But I always expected that people like John Alexander would speak out against what the government was doing there. They didn't. They voted for it 3 times. And I think that may have hurt them tonight.
Yeah, as you say, it's 20 past 6. Well, that'll become a bit clearer. Let's talk across now to our Canberra bureau and our national affairs correspondent, Greg Jennett, joins us. Now, Greg, I'm not sure if you heard earlier when I asked both Trent Zimmerman and Tony Burke what this means for Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten, and both of them sort of kept their warrior hat on, so I'm hoping that you're going to give us some truth serum. What does this mean for them?
Well, I think they're probably being guarded at this point. Let's be generous in our interpretation, Bridget. The night is young. But look, let's reduce it purely to numbers. If this exercise in democracy is to have any significance tonight, it's all, nationally, that is, outside of the electorate, it's about the magic number of 76 in the House of Representatives at the moment. Or the 76 they had when John Alexander was in the Parliament in the Liberal ranks. So the real risk here and the national significance of this by-election is if the government slips to 75. Now, that would be 75, including the Speaker, Tony Smith, but he doesn't actually get to exercise that vote in a scenario where Labor went to, for argument's sake, 70, and they were to win the support of all 5 crossbenchers in the House. So That would put the government at 74 in effect, and Labor with all of the crossbenchers at 75. It's a precarious position to be in. It certainly does not mean the downfall of the government necessarily, particularly if, as we understand it, people like Cathy McGowan have been getting particularly close to the government, very friendly relations being fostered there in recent weeks and months, not just around the Bennelong by-election, by the way, but with all the uncertainty that surrounded the absence of Barnaby Joyce as well. So, yeah, just to repeat, if this is to become nationally significant, it's around a scenario that says the Liberal Party lose the seat.
And, of course, we've seen senior front benches from both sides flooding the electorate of Bennelong. How significant is that? Obviously, it shows that they were both how seriously they're taking this by-election.
Yeah, full commitment by both sides. So no one's tried to take out insurance here to protect a leader. Both were equally and fully exposed to this exercise, Bill Shorten and the Prime Minister as well. So they were there on a regular basis. So too were a whole slew of frontbenchers from both sides. In fact, it's been highly coordinated. Once Parliament wasn't sitting, that last week or so was particularly busy with the arrival of frontbenchers in to shore up these campaigns. Then there's the resourcing as well, which has been significant. The polling on top of that, nothing's been spared here. It's quite a different scenario really to New England, which was isolated. It almost shunned national media attention, at least in the design of the Nationals campaign for Barnaby Joyce. This is a full head-to-head contest, of course, with credible candidates from both parties being fielded.
All right, Greg Jennett, we're going to be talking to you again throughout the evening. Thanks for joining us for now.
Thank you.
The by-election has been a tight race between the incumbent Liberal John Alexander, whose dual citizenship forced him to recontest the seat, and former New South Wales Labor Premier Christina Keneally. But their fate may be determined by the minor parties and Bennelong's large Asian population, along with the larger than average, as we've mentioned, postal and pre-poll votes.
The foreigner who became an Australian, and the Australian who was also a foreigner. They come from vastly different backgrounds.
I have always believed that I am Australian and solely Australian.
I am definitely starting out as the underdog in this campaign.
And yet today it appears that very little separates John Alexander and Christina Keneally.
Mr. Alexander, how are you?
Welcome to Eastwood.
Who do you think has the advantage?
I think it's Labor.
I think probably John Alexander.
Well, I'm still thinking about it.
Residents here are also aware of just how crucial their vote is.
If the government is strong, they can do something more.
So does that worry you if John Alexander were to lose, that the government will lose its majority?
It's a worry, yeah.
If Labor were to win in Bennelong, then Bill Shorten would become very close to becoming Prime Minister.
If you want to send a message to Mr Turnbull about healthcare and about all the other matters, then don't vote for John Alexander.
The two major candidates are trying to win votes by playing to people's fears.
Bill Shorten has promised to get rid of negative gearing. We have had the biggest uplift in property prices of anywhere in Australia, 74% in 3 years. Therefore, if you get rid of negative gearing, we will have the biggest crash.
This is my local community. I mean, I know what's going on in the schools here. I know what's going on with Medicare and with cuts to health. And the reality is it's hurting families.
While the frontrunners talk about the future, voters must also consider their past. Demeaning jokes from Alexander in the 90s.
Wasn't that little tramp, that little girl with the curly hair Nelly?
And for Keneally.
Look, a premier gets lobbied regularly. It's part of being job a premier.
Presiding over a New South Wales government which included the corrupt ministers Eddie Obeid and Ian MacDonald.
The way that Mr Obeid and Mr MacDonald used government as a personal plaything.
History also shows that since a redistribution which took in a greater migrant population, any result is possible in one of the country's most diverse electorates. Once a safe Liberal seat, Bennelong has had just 4 members since its creation 68 years ago. Its longest-serving MP, John Howard, lost to Labor's Maxine McHugh when he lost government in 2007. But just 3 years later, amid the turmoil of the Rudd-Gillard government, McHugh lost to John Alexander. 2017 has created more uncertainty, with the Australian Conservatives fielding a candidate.
And we're going to do remarkably well here because the Australian people are demanding a better way. They recognise that, the two-party duopoly is no longer working for them.
With Bennelong returning a majority no vote in the same-sex marriage survey, the Conservatives plan to capture a significant protest vote. The Christian Democrats' Gui Donghao is also expecting to attract the Conservative Christian vote and the support of the Chinese community. So where are your preferences likely to flow to?
We gave to Australia Conservative. We believe they have most close point of view with us.
Around a quarter of Bennelong's population is of Asian descent, and community leader Tony Teng believes the Asian vote will determine the outcome.
If any party can capture most of the Asian votes, I believe they can win.
While local issues have dominated the campaign, Tony Teng is in no doubt that the government's allegations of Chinese political influence in Australia will influence this poll.
Our Chinese community, they always consider Australia first. So this issue about the China panic thing is actually damaging the Liberals.
Given what's at stake, it's understandable why voters feel overwhelmed. Yet many still head to the polling booth undecided.
Liberal, I think.
You're not sure about that?
Yeah, well, I'm tossing between the two.
Well, we're going to return now to our political reporter, Stephen Jedgetts, who's with Chinese community leader Justin Lee.
Well, hi, Bridget. I am here with Justine Lee from the Australian Asian Association of Bennelong. There's been an enormous amount of talk about the Chinese community in Bennelong and what impact their votes will have on the contest tonight. Justin, thanks very much for joining us. I appreciate it. Can I ask, perhaps at the beginning, can you take a punt? Who do you think will win tonight?
I still think it's pretty close. I think most people are tipping that John Alexander might just cross the line, but by a whisker. He'll be counting on the Australian Conservatives and the Christian Democrats' preferences coming his way. I think the only safe prediction we can make is most Bennelong voters will be enormously relieved that this election's now over and they won't be bombarded with all the advertising and the robocalls over the last couple of weeks.
What's your read on the mood of the electorate, and what do you think the main issues are that are going to determine the result tonight?
Yeah, look, I saw voters at polling booths this morning. They weren't giving much away. Most voters were pretty polite and they took how to vote cards from everybody, but they were keeping their opinions pretty close to their chests. Bennelong is a predominantly middle-class suburb, electorate, much like other Australian electorates. And the main issues which resonate in this community are to do with economy, health and education, local transport and infrastructure.
Now, there's been an enormous amount of controversy in Canberra over Senator Sam Dastyari. The government's been pursuing him over his links to Chinese political donors, and Labor's accused them of whipping up xenophobia against the Chinese community. Do you think that argument resonated here in Bennelong, and could it have an impact on the result tonight?
Look, there have been lots of claims and counterclaims on all of these issues. And yes, look, it may sway some voters, but ultimately I think most voters are more concerned about paying off their mortgages, paying off their bills, having their kids get a good education. I guess once you've taken care of all of those issues, you might have time to think about motherland or global politics, but that's not a luxury most Bennelong voters will have.
So it's a third or a fourth order issue, you think, for many of these voters?
Correct. It's not a top priority issue. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the Chinese community here in Bennelong is fairly diverse in itself. The Chinese Australian voters in Bennelong can come from any number of places. They can come from mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore. And they've also settled in Australia at different times. And so I think it's not really possible to say all of these people are all just going to think and vote in one particular way or another.
Do you think our political leaders have made that mistake? Have they assumed that the community is monolithic? Have they ignored some of those subtleties?
The community here is very diverse, and they've got a range of different opinions. As I said, I don't think they'll be voting as a single bloc, yeah, it will be interesting to see the result tonight.
All right, well, there you go, Bridget. That's the word from the ground. It obviously will be important how the Chinese community vote, but there are no simple answers and no simple formulas. As ever, it's a complicated story.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen Jedgetts. And now let's go back to Anthony Green. So, Anthony, in the electorate, there are some wealthy parts of the electorate and not so wealthy parts. What booths do you think we're likely to see from first tonight?
There's two small booths at the southern end of the southeastern corner in Putney, and both of them are in Putney. One's called Right South. They're both down the bottom end and under 1,000 votes, and both voted pretty solidly for the Liberal Party, as did Gladesville North, another one of the smaller booths. There's a collection of very strong Liberal booths up around Epping and Carlingford and Eastwood as well, but they're much larger polling places up there, and in between is a bit more socially mixed territory. Now, at the last election, I think only one booth voted Labor anyway, so it was a very strong Liberal result last time, but you would expect Labor will do better in places like Ermington and Top Ryde and those sorts of areas in between. So we'll see a bit of a patchy collection of first figures coming in. We can correct for where the information is from, so we should be able to get an accurate swing pretty quickly. Yeah. But it's still, and the other thing is, if the Chinese community has had a particular impact, has swung a particular way for particular reasons, is the booths where they tend to live, a lot of them around Eastwood, will be the ones where you would see that quite different swing.
Is it too early to look at any of the graphics yet or anything?
I haven't got any figures, so there's no graphics to show.
There's no figures as yet.
Can we see an empty pie chart or something?
Can we add the figures that we like?
Okay, we were talking earlier, Trent, before we came in about, and you also mentioned it, Tony Burke, about this sort of, I suppose, low voter turnout and a range of reasons. But what were some of the figures, can you take us through, that you were hearing? They're quite amazed. I was quite amazed.
Our polling booth workers were reporting, for example, at Eastwood, one of the bigger booths, last time 3,000 voters, this time under 1,500. So quite a dramatic change. But in
so
contrast,
do you know if that's because of pre-poll, or is it because people have gone on holidays and they're going to cop or they just
the early
decided not to
voting
vote
has a big impact. And the interesting thing about this by-election, and it's a trend we're seeing in general elections as well, but not quite so dramatically, is that the number of postal votes cast almost doubled, and the number of pre-poll votes cast increased by around 50%. So there are, in fact, something like 14,000 voters who voted early this time that didn't last time, and that's something like 30% of the electorate had already cast their vote before today. And that's going to be quite interesting in terms of how we analyse the figures, because the postal voting counting doesn't start till tomorrow. Pre-poll, we won't get the outcomes until the wee hours of tonight, when I suspect we won't be here. And I'm not quite sure how easy, and Anthony will have a view on this, I'm sure that how easily we can extrapolate the normal trends when you're seeing such a large jump in the number of people pre-polling and postal voting.
Anthony, why do the postal votes not start? Why don't they start counting till tomorrow?
Well, basically, because postal votes are all in envelopes, they all have to be heavily scrutinized. I mean, the parties want to have people there looking at the envelopes. Now, it's impossible to count them on election night at a general election. Perhaps you could put more resources into a by-election because the parties have more staff. But the biggest thing that stops these things being counted is basically the parties do not have people available to scrutiny the count, and so the Commission won't count votes unless there is representatives of the candidates and parties to observe the process.
It's interesting, though, with more and more postal votes, as you talk about in pre-poll, it's something that the parties are going to have to think about. Otherwise, every election, you're never going to have results on the night.
Well, with this one, there's three things that I think have been going on. First, the general trend towards early voting is just continuing. Secondly, school holidays have started. So a whole lot of people had already organised to be away, so that's made an impact on the number of votes today. But the third thing, which will be the unexpected part of it all, it was a scorching hot day in Sydney today, and there will be people who had intended to vote who didn't as a result of that, or turned up, saw a long queue in the blazing heat.
And thought, I'm standing in this, I'm going to the shopping centre where it's air-conditioned and doing my Christmas shopping.
The number of early voters certainly wouldn't explain that huge gap, so it explains probably half of it, but not the if those figures are replicated across the electorate, not why that turnout so low.
Did you see the big voter turnout early?
No, that was actually one of the surprising things. I was on a booth at 7:30 and I got there early because normally there's the queue forming. There was a little bit of a queue, but the Apple store probably had a bigger queue. But so it was not the rush that you normally see at the beginning of the day. And I thought it might translate. I thought first day of holidays, people doing Christmas shopping, that rush might occur at the end of the day. But apparently that hasn't occurred either.
I didn't get to my booth till 9:30.
Why? You're a bit slack this morning.
I had my piano lesson. I've got a piano lesson every Saturday morning, 8 a.m. It doesn't shift.
You're learning the piano?
I've been learning for years. I'm not getting much better, but yeah. No. Even a by-election will not get in the way of the piano lesson.
So Bridget, when we get boring, I think we've got the entertainment lined up.
I remember George Bush's former security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, was an excellent pianist and used to regularly entertain foreign guests.
Lee Sales is an excellent pianist as well.
Yeah, who got to use Paul McCartney's piano.
Amazing.
It was outrageous.
Oh, well, we'll get you to, you never know what we can do later on.
A 7:30 duet.
That's right. Well, that can be the purpose of your dance floor.
That's true.
You're watching our continuing coverage of the Bennelong by-election, of course, with Anthony Green, the ABC's election analyst, Labor's Tony Burke and the Liberals' Trent Zimmerman. We'll be bringing you up-to-minute details in results, of course, as they occur. It's a little bit early, but Anthony Green is closely watching for figures. But now let's get some of the day's other news with Nina Murata.
Hello, Nina Murata with an ABC News update. Counting is well underway in the Bennelong by-election, with both major parties expecting the final result to go down to the wire. The Prime Minister today conceded there'd be a large swing against his government, as both he and opposition leader Bill Shorten campaigned in the seat right to the end. A loss by Liberal candidate John Alexander to former New South Wales Labor Premier Christina Keneally would cost the Prime Minister his one-seat majority in the lower.
In the end, all politics is local.
OK, so that is a Bennelong bruiser.
Tonight, Malcolm Turnbull's majority in Parliament lies in the hands of 100,000 voters in Bennelong.
It's a very, very close contest.
John Alexander is all that stands between the Prime Minister and disaster.
Australia's security, prosperity depends on John Alexander being back, part of our government.
I've had pressure before in big matches. I'm fine, thank you.
And Malcolm Turnbull made yet another swing through the seat today, scrapping for every vote.
Please support John Alexander today.
But the candidate largely dodged questions from the media.
This is about the voters of Bennelong, none of whom can get to vote because you're standing in the way. So let's catch up later.
His high-profile challenger was less camera shy.
Guys, how are ya?
She spent the dying hours of the campaign as she started it, hammering the coalition on bread and butter issues, education, health and traffic.
Send Malcolm Turnbull a message. Enough is enough. Enough of your cuts.
And Labor's still accusing the government of stoking xenophobia against Chinese Australians in its pursuit of Labor Senator Sam Dastyari. But when pressed for an example, Bill Shorten pointed to this statement.
Zhongguo Runmen Zanchi Lai. The Chinese people have stood up.
There's no doubt in my mind that when he starts quoting Chairman Mao in Chinese, you just go, what's going on?
What do the voters make of it? Most are just sick of being hassled on the phone and at the train station.
Hi, have a lovely Christmas.
They just want this carnival of democracy to end.
I didn't like the campaigns at all, the backbiting and unpleasantness.
And as counting begins, both sides are fixated on the numbers which could reshape federal politics.
Thank you.
John Alexander holds Bennelong by a hefty margin of almost 10%, and both major parties predict that he will hang on narrowly. So do the polls, but they could be unreliable because so many fed-up voters are simply hanging up on pollsters. The reality is no one knows exactly what will happen tonight. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Sydney.
3 people have been taken to hospital after a collision between a Manly ferry and a yacht near Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour. The Narrabeen and the yacht collided at about 2:30 this afternoon. Transport for New South Wales says several people were thrown from the yacht but have since been rescued. It's understood there were no serious injuries. The yacht was towed into Rushcutters Bay and the ferry went on to Circular Quay. Police are investigating. The Vatican has released a statement saying that the final report from the Child Abuse Royal Commission deserves to be studied seriously. It says the report is the result of what it calls accurate efforts made by the Commission. The Holy See says it remains committed to being close to Australia's Catholic Church as it makes efforts to bring healing and justice to the victims and survivors. Meanwhile, the recommendations on celibacy and confession have been widely rejected by senior Australian Catholics. Hattie Johnston is the founder of Bravehearts, Australia's leading child protection advocate. She says the prevention of child sexual assault is important because it manifests itself in society.
The toll of child sexual assault across Australia and in particular in the institutions is just been enormous. And I think for everybody across the country, it's been a wake-up time for them to understand that this happens not just in institutions but everywhere, but also the level of pain and suffering that's attached to this level of offending, not just for the victims but for the victim's family and for the wider community. The manifestation of child sexual assault in the person themselves and across the community shows itself in everything that costs the community a whole bunch of money. So we're talking about mental health issues, eating disorders, youth suicide, inability to form peer relationships and even marriages, inability to sexual confusion, sexual dysfunction, inability to finish your education because you're not concentrating on what you should be concentrating on. It manifests through every vein of society, and it is, for every survivor, the level of dysfunction attached that comes with this or harm that comes with this is different. But certainly if you talk to anybody that's looking at the homeless shelters and the mental health institutions and all, the jails, these places are full of people who've been sexually assaulted as children, and that's why prevention is so important. And yet as a nation we still don't really quite get that.
A strong earthquake has struck off the coast of Java in Indonesia, killing at least 2 people. The magnitude 6.5 quake struck close to midnight local time, and it was felt 200 kilometres away in the capital, Jakarta. The powerful tremors lasted nearly 30 seconds in some areas, resulting in extensive damage to buildings in western Java. The US and North Korea have locked horns at the United Nations in a heated exchange over Pyongyang's nuclear program. The US Secretary of State says there should be no talks with North Korea until the rogue regime ceases its missile tests for a sustained period of time. Rex Tillerson had previously said the US had no precondition for talks.
When North Korea tested its most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile last month, it raised the stakes in the bitter conflict with the United States and its allies. Today, for the first time in a decade, the American Secretary of State was eye-to-eye with Pyongyang's ambassador, and the tension was high.
They alone are responsible for these tensions. They alone must take responsibility for these tensions, and they alone can solve these tensions.
Anyone is to blame for it. The U.S. is the one who must be held accountable.
For Washington and its friends in the region, the prospect of nuclear war is untenable. But the risk is their attempts to deter North Korea will make a conflict more likely.
With a sense of urgency, we should make North Korea perceive without a doubt that it will pay heavily for its provocations.
The international community will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea.
Rex Tillerson had previously said there were no preconditions for talks with Pyongyang. But today he said negotiations can only start once North Korea stops testing missiles.
We are going to be prepared should something go wrong, and our military is prepared.
President Donald Trump raised North Korea with his Russian counterpart in a telephone conversation.
The primary point was to talk about North Korea, because we would love to have his help on North Korea. China's helping, Russia's not helping. We'd like to have Russia's help, very important.
And Mr. Trump again denied his campaign had sought Russian help to put him in the White House. Jonathan Flynn, ABC News.
Director Peter Jackson has admitted to blacklisting 2 Hollywood actresses on the advice of Harvey Weinstein's production company Miramax. Jackson revealed he showed interest in hiring Mira Sorvino and Ashley Judd to work on the Lord of the Rings films while pitching to Miramax in the late 1990s. The actor says he was advised to avoid working with them and believes that was likely to be part of a smear campaign. Mira Sorvino responded, saying it was confirmation Weinstein had derailed her career. "Just seeing this after I awoke, I burst out crying," the actress said. "There it is, confirmation that Harvey Weinstein derailed my career, something I suspected but was unsure. Thank you, Peter Jackson, for being honest." Ashley Judd also responded to Jackson's comments and recalled having detailed talks with the director about the Lord of the Rings film. "They asked which of the 2 roles I preferred, and then I abruptly never heard from them again. I appreciate the truth coming out," the actress said. Prince Harry will marry his fiancée, Meghan Markle, on 19th May next year. The couple announced their engagement last month and said the service will be held at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The wedding is scheduled for the same day as the FA Cup final and presents a potential conflict for Prince William, who would normally attend the match as president of the English Football Association. And that's the latest news update from me. Now it's back to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Nina. And let's go now to Lucy Carter, who's at Labor's base for the night in Ryde. We spoke to her earlier. Lucy, we're all wondering here, has the dance floor been set up? Are there people on it yet?
Well, look, they're standing around. As you can see behind me, it's certainly getting a little bit crowded here. There are volunteers pouring in from all of the polling booths that they've been manning over today. Labor says that throughout the campaign, they've had 4,000 volunteers working on Christina Keneally's campaign, with today more than 1,000 handing out how to vote cards. And it seems like all of them are probably going to turn up here tonight because there is a bar tab. Labor does say the strength of its campaign is in its numbers and the focus that they've had on the local issues.
All right, Lucy, thank you. We'll be coming back to you again soon, I'm sure. OK, look, 4,000 volunteers, that's pretty amazing. Trent Zimmerman, and we'll come to you in a minute, Tony Burke, but Trent, same sort of numbers, your side?
Yeah, I think today on polling booths we were pretty much evenly matched, but it's been a huge effort during the course of this campaign, and not just at pre-poll and the door knocking and the letterboxing, but in addition to those robocalls, humans are actually ringing voters as well these days.
Have you been ringing?
I haven't personally, but I know many of my colleagues have. And in fact, our competition on Sky tonight, Chris Pine, was ringing, I know, from Canberra a couple of weeks ago, and actually got accused by one of the voters of being a computer-generated robocall, and he proceeded to have an argument for about 15 minutes trying to prove that it was the real person.
I couldn't imagine.
He can talk that way.
I think it's pretty hard to believe that Chris Pine could ever be a computer.
I remember the first time I ever received a robocall from Malcolm Turnbull, and it was that, it's a robocall.
He doesn't call me.
Them?
He doesn't call me.
Did you have to make them?
I went into our phone room one night, but I was only there to talk to the volunteers, and then I had to get out again to something else. So I haven't made any this time round.
Did they think you'd be a liability on the phone, Tony?
That's.
What about you, Ted?
Maybe they didn't think I was a
invite me,
robot
so
anyway.
obviously they thought I was a liability.
But you're in the electorate next door.
Yeah.
You would have been in Bennelong quite a bit.
Yes, I've been out in the railway stations and at pre-poll a couple of times, and it's by-elections are intense beats. Of course, I was elected in a by-election after Joe Hockey went to Washington, and I think for any candidate, and I feel some sympathy for anyone standing in a by-election, particularly one that has the national spotlight like this one. It's a very taxing process. But at the same time, for those of us that are elected, campaigning is our bread and butter, and it's a great opportunity to be connecting with residents and voters, and that's why I love campaigns, because you are out there meeting the people who decide your fate.
Yeah, my role during the campaign, because I've got the multicultural affairs portfolio, has been very much with the Chinese media, with the Korean media in particular. So that's sort of been my role each day. A few visits out to the seat itself, but a lot of my engagement's been through that media. I think the wonderful thing with the volunteers, I'm not sure how it ended up in the final week, because obviously Parliament took over for us, but early on, Labor in terms of numbers was definitely winning on the ground. There was some great images that were going up on social media in terms of number of people at different events.
Do you agree with that? Labor was winning?
Yeah, certainly a pre-poll when I was there earlier on, Labor certainly had more. But I actually, in some ways, thought that at times it could be counterproductive. So when people were trying to get to pre-poll, they literally had to fight their way through a phalanx of volunteers, full stop. And I suspect they blamed you more than us because you were there in greater number at that early stage. But,
but
the numbers even up as the campaign.
My favourite volunteer image was still of the phones. Where you've got these rooms where everyone's doing the phone calls, and you often take the photo for the social media posts.
Oh, yes.
That was when you had John Alexander with his volunteers, and none of their phones were plugged in, which I hoped was a principle they kept to the entire campaign.
They were probably just cordless phones, Tony. Modern technology.
Surely they're on mobiles, weren't they? No one has landline phones. That's the whole problem with polling, isn't it? We've mentioned the Chinese and what's some of the things that have been going on. I suppose you could say in recent days we've seen there have been some reports in local Chinese media urging some to send the government a message. On the other hand, John Alexander said that the issues that emerged from the Sam Dastyari affair simply, didn't figure in this by-election. Firstly, Tony, is that right? Do you think this is something that is more attached to the Chinese voters or not? Is there a...
Well, in part, we find out shortly as to how the mix of everything's unfolded, but it's also the case that there are different... Well, first of all, no ethnic community is monolith. So just as you'll have people of similar ethnic backgrounds, of Caucasian background with completely different political views, you'll get the same of that in every community. There will still be trends. At the last election, there was no doubt there was a trend that the Chinese community, in greater numbers than previously, voted Liberal. That did happen at the last election. And there is no doubt, to my mind, from what I've seen anecdotally, that there is a significant shift back towards Labor that's happening in that community at the moment. Now, the extent to which that happens, I don't know. And a lot of those votes won't simply be because of identity politics. It might be because people are frustrated with the NBN. It might be that people have views on tertiary education policy or on health policy. So it'll be for a range of reasons. But there was a trend at the last election towards the Liberal Party, and certainly anecdotally what I've seen very strongly is a trend back to us.
Trent, what do you think about that? Do you agree with Tony
Well, I
on
start
that?
with Tony's caveat that time will shortly tell. But look, can I firstly agree with Tony that it is wrong to typify a whole community as moving as a bloc. But
do you think that has happened a bit during this campaign from both sides?
because there have been a lot of Chinese community leaders locally and more broadly that have endorsed John Alexander, and he's had strong support from the Chinese community, which reflects his work in the local area.
Because we should remind people, I think it's 20% ethnically Chinese and 13% of people that were born in mainland China. That's about the breakup. So it's pretty...
And as one of your earlier across the show, there's also a strong community that has a Hong Kong background as well. But I think also you've got to look at the nature of the Chinese community in Bennelong. A lot of them are interested in policies that are going to support small business. A lot of them have got their own businesses. And I think we had a very strong message on that. And I think that would have resonated with that part of the community exceptionally well.
There's certainly some language that was used in the Parliament that would not have helped the Liberal Party with the community, like using Shanghai Sam as a term of abuse or Szechuan Sam as a term of abuse. There's no way that could have gone down well.
I think people understood that Sam did the wrong thing, and by any measure, whether you've got a Chinese heritage or otherwise, the fact that he was doing the things that he did, I think would have been repugnant to every Australian. And so I'm not quite sure whether that's going to have the big impact that it's been slated to have. I think what did have a big impact, particularly during the last week, is that once Sam resigned, the speculation and Christina Keneally's refusal to rule out going to the Senate would have made people think about whether her commitment to Bennelong was as deep and abiding as she so often claimed.
Yeah, I'll give the Liberal Party this. It was a clever tactic for them to run that argument because,
but she
of course,
refused to rule it out, Tony.
No. But of course, think it through. The moment you contemplate anything beyond Election Day, if you refuse to rule out will you or will you not go back to Sky News, the moment you contemplate defeat, you are finished. Absolutely finished. So it was a clever strategic ploy from the Liberal Party in doing that.
So what about
will Christina Keneally have your support for the Senate?
So what about Sam Dastyari's resignation and what impact do you think that's had? You know, it did leave Christina having to field those questions about will you run for the Senate if you don't win.
I think
a win or loss for you.
I think it had two impacts. No doubt there was a story going back and forth that was bad for Labor. No doubt about that. And the other thing that was happening at the same time, the decision of the government to focus so heavily on that issue meant, particularly that week that we had in Parliament, the government had made a decision that the issues they would be talking about and pushing hard were not the issues that most Australians would consider the most important to them if they're voting in a by-election. Now, that was a strategic call. You always make the decision when if you're going on the attack, that you're going to be talking politics rather than people's household lives. And the subject matter, yep, no doubt that hurt us during that time. But the decision of the Prime Minister that would become the major national conversation, I'm not sure how smart that was.
But a Sam Dastyari resignation is a win for the Liberal Party. You know, it'd be no different if one of their MPs stood down. You'd see it as a win for you.
Yeah, there will be a difference that will come in the future. There'll be another difference that comes in the future because up until now, in the course of Australian politics, whenever there's been, let's use the word scandal, there has never been an occasion where the demand has been that the person had to leave the Parliament. Never. Now, that is a fundamental shift that has now happened. You've got people like Stuart Roberts sitting on the backbench. You think of the reasons that he lost ministerial office. The moment he did, we let it go. And I made a number of comments during this whole saga where I said the government needs to think very carefully if they want this to be the new benchmark. They decided they did. That's where we now are.
I'm going to come back to Anthony and Greg Jennett in a moment, but just one more thing talking about that. You as the multicultural affairs as Shadow, and also Trent because you're in the electorate next door. How much do the community, the Chinese community, have loyal ties to the People's Republic of China, and would this really affect their vote? You know, and I think that's what people are trying to work out, where their loyalties lie.
I think you need to look at it in terms of people, when they make a citizenship pledge to Australia, they make it and they mean it. The extent to which it's about the People's Republic of China, I don't see as a vote shifter. The extent to which people feel they've been questioned through various policies about their own heritage and identity, that's a different issue.
What do you think, Trent?
I think that the Chinese Australian community is rightly proud and celebrates their Chinese heritage, and as does any part of the international diaspora, and they've got good cause to do so. But you've got to remember they've chosen to live in Australia and not China, and they've done that for a reason. So they want to be here. They want all of the values that Australia offers them, and I think that their loyalty will always be to Australia. But can I come back to the point that Tony made? I mean, the timing of Sam Dastyari's most recent failings was not that of the government, and they were serious. So you just can't brush this under the carpet. And in fact, it was the media, obviously, that exposed the fact that he'd misled people about what he'd said at that press conference 12 months ago.
So when the media said that they had access to information collected by intelligence agencies, you're saying the government had nothing to do with that access being made available?
Well, it's a serious allegation. You're saying the intelligence agencies are leaking, but...
Well, no, I don't think the intelligence agencies did. I presumed it was the government that did it. If you're saying it wasn't the government, then the government had nothing to do with it.
I think you're making a massive assumption there.
No, but if you're making the assertion that the timing of all of this was not a decision of the government, the only conclusion then is that the information came from the intelligence agencies.
Well, no, it's not. I mean, you don't know who else was at that press conference who might have recorded it, for example. It wasn't simply two people and in a room. It was two people with a whole bunch of journalists.
No, the way that what Fairfax wrote was that they had seen information collected by intelligence agencies.
Well, I can't comment about how that was possibly leaked. But the point, though, is...
I'm going to have to interrupt you two, and there's never any leaks from anyone in government or opposition ever.
Okay,
Let's go to Anthony now. You've got some
I've
figures.
got some numbers. I'm going to have a go a bit blind here for the operator who's driving the graphics. But the first polling place has come in. It's Ryde St Anne's, which is quite a small one. There's the first preference votes. We'll just stay there for the moment. You can see that John Alexander's got 39.8. On a matched figure, he's down about 7%. Christina Kennedy, 36. Justin Alex, 7.6. Let's look at the change in first preference votes. And just as a warning here, this is the last figure last graphic I'll do. But with 0.6% counted, the Liberal vote's well down there by 10.6% on a match basis. The Labor vote's up 7.6%. But there's been a bit of a switch over to the Conservative vote. That's only one very small polling place at this stage. So that's looking like an 8% swing at this stage. That's certainly only one polling place, but that's the first figure in.
I'm not ready to go home.
But that would be pretty consistent with the polling showing a 52-48 type outcome.
OK, let's see what Greg Jennett in Canberra thinks of that. Greg Jennett, did you just hear what Anthony was saying there about the first results?
Yeah, obviously they are small numbers to be working off, and I don't know as much, Bridget, as Anthony would about the profile of that particular booth, and, you know, you wouldn't want to hang your hat on one booth this early. But, look, just picking up, though, on the discussion you were having just before that first set of figures came in. Sinophobia, yeah, I mean, I'll be as interested as anyone to see whether this was, in fact, a factor in this by-election, and we'll know that by the end of tonight. But on the timing question, which I think the panel was picking apart just before Anthony gave us those numbers, it was a rather weird confluence of events there where Sam Dastyari, let's go out on a limb here and say that that wasn't timed by the government. It's just a revelation that came from Fairfax Media in the first instance, and they were among many media outlets that have been trying to obtain recordings of that Bligh Street Government Offices media conference that had been held for Chinese media only last year. No one else has been able to obtain recordings, and eventually some did out on that. But also a confluence of things like the government's foreign interference package of legislation tabled in the Parliament on the very last hours of sitting this year. Now, that's long been in the planning. I think its release was slated months ago for year's end, well before the existence of any Bennelong by-election could have been known or would have been known. And then there's the by-election itself. And once we get there, I've been watching from afar this week, slipping in some early leave and just consuming the sort of statements that have been made at home more as a viewer than as a reporter. I found it somewhat frustrating because there was a lot of projection of offence. We were told that people were taking offence to what they were hearing, but very little direct evidence of offence being expressed by anyone. So it was hard to reconcile what in fact is real and what is asserted by others. And then there's the question of who or whom might be taking offence. Is it Chinese people who came from Hong Kong, and there are large numbers of those in Bennelong? Is it mainland Chinese? Is it Taiwanese people in Bennelong? Is it dinky Dias, fully Australian resident people of Chinese ethnicity? I mean, none of this has really been explored. It's just been kind of asserted so far in the midst of a campaign.
Greg Jennett, we're going to come back to you. Just stay with us there. Of course, you're watching ABC News Channel's continuing coverage of the Bennelong by-election. The poll was triggered by sitting member John Alexander, who was caught up in the dual citizenship saga. The by-election has huge federal implications, as a Liberal loss would see the Prime Minister lose his one-seat majority in the lower house. However, most Bennelong voters seem more concerned with local issues. I'm joined in the studio by Leader of Opposition Business Tony Burke and Liberals MP Trent Zimmerman, and of course the ABC's election analyst Anthony Green. Polling points to a narrow win for Liberal candidate John Alexander, but Labor's Christina Keneally remains confident of getting enough of a swing to take the seat.
In the end, all politics is local.
OK, so that is a Bennelong bruiser.
Tonight, Malcolm Turnbull's majority in Parliament lies in the hands of 100,000 voters in Bennelong.
It's a very, very close contest.
John Alexander is all that stands between the Prime Minister and disaster.
Australia's security, prosperity depends on John Alexander being back, part of our government.
I've had pressure before in big matches. I'm fine, thank you.
And Malcolm Turnbull made yet another swing through the seat today, scrapping for every vote.
We support John Alexander today.
But the candidate largely dodged questions from the media.
This is about the voters of Bennelong, none of whom can get to vote because you're standing in the way. So let's catch up later.
Thanks, everyone. His high-profile challenger was less camera shy.
Guys, how are ya?
She spent the dying hours of the campaign as she started it, hammering the coalition on bread and butter issues, education, health and traffic.
Send Malcolm Turnbull a message. Enough is enough. Enough of your cuts.
And Labor's still accusing the government of stoking xenophobia against Chinese Australians in its pursuit of Labor Senator Sam Dastyari. But when pressed for an example, Bill Shorten pointed to this statement.
Zhongguo Runmen Zanchi Lai. The Chinese people have stood up.
There's no doubt in my mind that when he starts quoting Chairman Mao in Chinese, you just go, what's going on?
What do the voters make of it? Most are just sick of being hassled on the phone and at the train station.
Hi, have a lovely Christmas.
They just want this carnival of democracy to end.
I didn't like the campaigns at all, the backbiting and unpleasantness.
And as counting begins, both sides are fixated on the numbers which could reshape federal politics.
Thank you.
John Alexander holds Bennelong by a hefty margin of almost 10%, and both major parties predict that he will hang on narrowly. So do the polls, but they could be unreliable because so many fed-up voters are simply hanging up on pollsters. The reality is no one knows exactly what will happen tonight. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Sydney.
But we are getting closer to know what's going to happen tonight. Back to Anthony Green, who has some more figures coming in from... You've got more booths?
We've got 3 polling places. We've got the St George Anglican Church Hall in Eastwood. We've got Ryde North Trust, the Truscott Primary School in Ryde North, and we've still got that Ryde St Anne booths. They're the numbers we're seeing at the moment. John Alexander 46.6. That Eastwood booth is one of the stronger Liberal booths. And on those numbers, the Liberal vote is ahead. Let's look at the change in first preference vote, which is the where we'll stop the graphics at this point. But the Liberal vote is down 4% on those 3 polling places. The Labor vote up 5.6%. The Christian Democrat vote's down, but most of that's gone to the Conservatives. The Green vote's slightly down. So on those numbers, that's looking like a 4 to 5% swing. That's with 3 polling places. We don't have a preference count yet, though.
I've just had Carlingford results come in. I'm not sure if they're on your computer yet. I've just got a text message that in Carlingford, Labor's vote is up 11.4% and the Liberals' primary is down 13.5%.
Have you got...
I know I haven't. I have to process this stuff yet. I can't look at the numbers when I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
How many polling booths are there?
39 counting centres tonight.
39 counting centres, OK. Trent, have you got anything from your scrutiny?
No, simply the Truscott booth, which I think was one of the ones that Anthony mentioned, had a 4.7 swing against us, which is consistent with those figures that Anthony had.
The difference with the Carlingford booth is this is the first result we have from one of the parts of the electorate with a significant Chinese population, people of Chinese background. And that 11.4% swing in the primary, now who knows where it lands after preferences, but that does mean it's the first indicator we've had that we may be getting very different results in some parts of the electorate to others.
As Anthony's saying, 4 or 5%, if that's showing 11%, there's quite a difference there.
Yeah, I don't have those Carlingford figures yet.
No. While you're getting some more figures, Anthony, let's just go back to Greg Jennett in Canberra. Greg, before we went for that, looking at the recap and what's been happening, can you just take us through those interference laws that you mentioned that have been tabled and the impact you think this might have?
Yeah, now this isn't actually a politically vexed package at the moment. I would even hazard a guess that as it makes its way through Parliament next year, much of it will find bipartisan support. But it had been worked up initially starting with national security agencies and months' worth of work done by the bureaucracy to finally land a package which essentially updates Cold War era or post-World War II era notions of treason and espionage against the state. It tries to bring it into the modern realm where cybersecurity is an issue, where critical infrastructure like a national broadband network, for instance, could be undone by significant foreign interference. So there are new categories of criminal offence there for anyone who engages in such conduct. There's also a register where if you are working for foreign governments or foreign interests, you are obliged to put your name on that register in the name of transparency. And then the third element, Bridget, is one which deals with foreign political donations, and it would ban them with some rigour around how you would monitor the finances of entities to actually identify and enforce when a foreign donation had been made. So bolstering the electoral law as well. So this is in its infancy as a legislative exercise because it only reached the Parliament at year's end, and it will work its way through committee examination and what have you next year, where I think it's safe to say Labor will end up on the same page on most key elements of this package.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Greg, Jeanette, what about the Sam Dastyari resignation? I'm sure you heard Trent and Tony having their opinion on what that meant. But from your analysis, what about the timing of the Sam Dastyari resignation?
In relation to the Bennelong by-election campaign, I think it's just classic removal of a distraction. I mean, it was being observed, wasn't it, that at each and every doorstop that Bill Shorten was attending, and he, as we've already noted tonight, made many visits into the Bennelong by-election campaign. The first 3 or 4 questions up until the day when Sam Dastyari left were always about Sam Dastyari, more on some occasions, but pretty quickly after he fell on his sword, that disappeared and they were back on to the chosen themes that Labor wanted to talk about, transport, school education funding, etc. So it did just lance the boil, I suppose. The point at which he walked away was the point at which Labor got to run a clearer campaign on the issues that it had identified as potential winners for Christina Keneally.
OK, Greg, you stand by. We'll come back to you. Let's go back to Anthony Green now at the desk with more results.
We've now got 4 polling places. We've got a Macquarie Park polling place in. So if we look at these raw numbers again, that's what we're seeing. We've just under 4% counted. The Liberal Party on 41.8, Christina Keneally, the Labor Party 37%, the Greens 7.8, and just under 8% split there between the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats. Let's look at the change in vote that's occurring again. This is just the graphic we're going to stop with. The Liberal vote on a polling place comparison is down 5.4. The Labor vote is up 6.8. Now, that's on 4 polling places. That's not a big enough swing to lose at this stage for the Liberal Party. It's too early to call, but we're not seeing a big enough swing on 4 polling places so far.
And usually, do you see, often in by-elections, do you see the swing quite early? Or?
Well, the swing's just sat at that level for the moment. Now, there are a lot bigger booths to come, but there's nothing suddenly showing up right at the start night as an enormous swing, but there is a lot more counting to come. But yeah, at the moment, it's looking like between 4 and 6% on the 4 polling places we have.
OK. Tony Burke, you mentioned before a swing of 11% at Carlingford booth, and that's got a big Chinese community. Were you surprised by that?
Yeah, I am. Everything we said at the beginning was right to say in terms of people vote for a whole lot of different reasons, and we shouldn't presume that communities are monoliths. That's the first signal we've seen that there might be tonight a very significant trend from people of Chinese and Korean heritage.
But it is one booth, and how big is Carlingford, Anthony?
Off the top of it, I can't tell you.
I've got that.
Oh, you can tell us.
Yeah, Carlingford, it's 1,300, so it's not. The biggest booths go to 3,000, but
right.
it's not a tiny booth. It's not like Putney or something like that.
No. But if you're seeing that swing at one of the bigger booths, that's
right, and
more significant.
And the more multicultural booths are the bigger booths.
OK, Anthony?
I have that booth in, and we should be able to look at the graphics of that. It's not that particular polling place, but this is now 5 polling places in total. Sorry, no, that hasn't We'll just have to come back again. I didn't publish that data. There we go.
That's OK.
If you go back to the start of the graphics there, and we'll just start that again. It should be over by now. Here we go. Yeah, 6.8% counted. The Liberal Party is on 43.6. Christina Keneally 35.7. So this includes that Carlingford booth, which is one you would expect to favour the Liberal Party. Let's look at that matched polling place swing on the first preferences, which is the next graphic, and it shows that the Liberal vote is down 5.9. the Labor Party vote up 6.7. So that's across 5 polling places. That's the swing, the change in first preference votes we're seeing at this stage.
Trent?
Well, obviously, I like those figures better than the alternative, but it is way too early to be making any judgment because I think what we are seeing is quite different results across different parts of the electorate. Until we've got some more results in, it's far too early to tell.
What did you make of the Carlingford booth?
Well, it is a smallish booth. It's not the smallest, but it's in the bottom half rather than the top half.
But Anthony said it's traditionally a Liberal booth.
That's correct, but I think we need to wait and see whether we've got some more, until we get some more results before we can make any pattern judgment.
We've been talking a lot about the broader issues and China and the government, and what about the local issues on the ground? What do you see? What were the local issues?
Well, I think that it was all about John Alexander, who I think is a popular local member, and he has delivered some strong outcomes for the local community, and we saw some of those in play during the election. So, for example, trying to address transport issues and the like, which plague my electorate as well as his. And I think that people recognise that during his time as member for Bennelong, he's been an exceptional local member.
He is a likeable candidate, John Alexander, but he scarcely appeared on the political radar before this by-election, and many expect him to retire. Do you think that could go against it?
Oh, that's one of the issues against him, and that's one of the reasons that I presume the Liberal Party ran the will Christina take the Senate vacancy issue to try to put a counter against the argument that he's going to retire at the next election anyway, which had been running reasonably strongly. I do disagree with the fundamental, though, of the concept that this by-election, the principal thing that people are voting on is John Alexander as a sitting MP.
Bridget asked about the local issues at play.
Yeah, no, but even
what do you think the local issues then? If it's not John Alexander and him having to recontest his seat, do you...
I think the quality of their NBN and the and Medicare issues running at a local level have been huge. I found it interesting. We only had 1 week of Parliament. We were meant to get 2. We only had 1 week of Parliament during this by-election. When we had it, the government decided to do question after question on different policy issues with reference to Bennelong. We made the decision to just run pretty much on the NBN every day. This is an area where the complaints have been high. And while, yes, NBN is a national project, as a local issue, the problems with the NBN have been extraordinarily strong.
As in many elections, the state and federal issues often overlap. And in that area, given it's got such large growth, you know, some of the schools have got overcrowding, those kind of things. Have they been issues that have come up? And transport, you know.
I think you find that across Sydney at the moment, and concern about development issues is something that I experience in my own electorate, and certainly in Bennelong they've got the similar type of issues, and it's really about making sure that infrastructure is keeping up with that development, and there's been concern that historically it hasn't. But I also think that played both ways, because a lot of development that's taking place was development that was put in place by the last Labor government in New South Wales, which one Christina Keneally happened to be Premier of for a while.
There's no doubt that overdevelopment's on my list too of issues that have been playing. We've got a very different take on it to what Trent just said, but I know you want to move on.
No, we can come back to it, but let's just go back to Anthony.
Yes, I've got some updates, and we'll run through the full graphics this time because we've got some 2 candidate preferred counts in now. So let's bring up that graphic and we'll look at the first preference votes again there. These are the same first preferences we had the first time, so it's still 43.6 to 35.7. Let's look at that change in first preference vote that we're seeing, and it's 5.9 down, 6.7 up. Now what we have is some preference counts for the first time, so we'll go on to the next graphic and show what we're seeing at the moment is a 2.6% swing to Labor. That's the first 3 small polling places that came in. So on those numbers, the swing is only 2.6. Now, what's come in since then is Marsfield and that Carlingford polling place. They're not factored in there. The swing got slightly bigger on those next ones, but 2.6 we'll probably be seeing in the next 2 or 3 booths, sort of whether that swing is settling down somewhere.
Okay. What's the biggest booth, did you say? Was it Eastwood?
It's somewhere down in Putney. I think it's about 4,500 votes. Yeah.
And traditionally a strong Liberal voting part of the electorate.
So Putney's got one of the biggest and one of the smallest, I think.
Yes.
Not uncommon.
Ryde East is the biggest, I think.
Yeah.
What does that?
There are 2 over 3,000.
Putney 4,700, Ryde East 3,100. So Putney's by far the biggest.
Just looking at the candidates, while we're still getting some more of the figures in, we mentioned about, let's look at Christina Keneally. And in the last few days, there's been some pretty brutal campaign material, including the website, ChristinaKeneally.com, trying to drag the ghosts of the Obeid era into the election. Is that fair, firstly, Trent?
Yeah, because she has headed up New South Wales and she therefore has a record in government, and it's entirely appropriate that voters are aware of that, reminded of that record. And you've got to remember that she headed a government which was unelected with the biggest swing in New South Wales history. And I think part of the concern about that government was the influence that people like Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi were having on its affairs.
Do you think the electorate can separate? Because Christina Keneally at the time in the 2010 election, when Barry O'Farrell came in, she was a very popular politician, and I think for a long time she was preferred premier over Barry O'Farrell, and obviously New South Wales Labor were massively on the nose and for a range of reasons. So do you think, and Tony Burke, have they been able to separate her from the Labor of the past?
Look, I think
it's a big call, though.
No, you go back to that election. We didn't lose that election because the Australian people had a view, or the people of New South Wales had a view, that Christina was the problem. There was a view at the time, well before Christina even became Premier, that that government was going to be voted out. And that's where that was. In terms of just what was said a moment ago about what is reasonable with someone's record, it certainly wasn't reasonable for the Prime Minister to make things up. It wasn't reasonable for the Prime Minister to claim that Christina Keneally appointed Eddie Obeid to her cabinet when that was completely wrong.
But she did appoint Ian McDonald.
Yeah, that's right, and that is something. Yeah, and she gave. And you can then get into all those arguments about she gave the evidence to put people in jail.
Well,
and all
the
that.
issue is, did Eddie Obeid give her the number?
No, but the Prime Minister said something that was factually wrong. For Christina's entire time in Parliament, he was never in the cabinet, including her premiership. Never.
Some updates.
We come back to that one. Open the can of worms.
I thought I'd interrupt with some facts, alternate facts. Some results. Now we've got. Let me have a look at my numbers here. It's 8 polling places, 7.8% counted. Again, we're seeing that similar first preference of 43 to 36 there. Let's look at that change in first preferences that's occurring again. 6.1% down for Liberal, Labor up 6.9. Now, I've now got 5 polling places in with a preference count, and if we have a look there, what we're seeing at the moment with that two-party preferred swing in that electorate, we're seeing, if I can see the graphic, here we go, it's a 1.8% swing, which is quite small, so that includes the Carlingford booth. So my gut feeling is there's actually some rather quite different flows of preferences than in the last election, because I would have expected that swing to be larger on that change in first preference vote. So my rough guess is that maybe the Conservative preferences are flowing very strongly, or the Green preferences are not flowing strongly, or the preferences from those other minor parties are not flowing particularly strongly.
So how many booths did you say all up? 7?
That is 8 first preferences and 5 with preferences.
And there's 30?
39 counting centres. That includes the pre-poll votes. So it's, I think, 36 polling places.
Okay.
One of the things that will be different here for both the Christian Democrat vote and the Australian Conservatives vote is in a by-election they have the capacity to staff every polling booth. So for the entire day. In a general election, they don't have the capacity to do that at every seat. So you will find their preference how to votes, which consistently go to the Liberal Party, that every voter will have gone into the polling booth having been offered one.
Okay.
And
Trent, what do you make of those?
Well, I'm getting the feedback from our scrutineers that about 90% of the preferences from the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats are flowing to the Liberal Party. And that is consistent, obviously, with the fact that they were on polling booths today asking for a protest vote, but actually saying, but we don't want to elect a shortened government.
It's also not the size of it's not the flow, or sometimes it's the size. The Conservative vote is up around 9% at the moment compared to 6% at the last election. The Green vote is down 2%. Now, if you're talking about strong preference flows there, the fact that there's been a shift between the minor parties creates a stronger flow to the Liberal Party than the last time. So it's actually the size of their vote rather than the strength of the flows.
And to be honest, you'd expect that on both fronts. The Green vote does tend to decline where there is a strong Labor campaign. But secondly, in a number of by-elections, including my own, we saw quite a significant primary vote swing. But then on preferences, the two-party preferred result was something entirely different and something far more gratifying. So you do see people park their first preference vote somewhere, but then come back with their second or third.
Going into this, when Christina Keneally, and getting back to, so you two can have your argument.
We've been pretty civil, I
We
think.
have been civil.
I did an election night with Erica Betts once, and it was completely different to this.
I wonder how I'd go with Erica.
She has, and she has certainly come out and said, yes, I did appoint Ian McDonald, and obviously, and she was strong at ICAC at the ICAC when Eddie Obeid and Ian McDonald were found to be corrupt, and certainly distanced herself from them. But what concern, you must have known the risks and the concern that that was going to be, brought up.
The only part of it
is there enough time? It's something that obviously New South Wales Labor at a state level will be watching closely.
The only part of it that I'm complaining about, that's all legitimate political debate back and forth, that they were there in the Parliament is true. The Ian McDonald thing, true. The fact that Christina gave the evidence that helped make sure they were locked up, also true. The only part of it that I have an objection to, in terms of it being part of the political debate, was Malcolm Turnbull inventing information about Obeid.
Is that Trent?
It wasn't true.
But can I say that, I think a mountain's been made out of a molehill in this one instance. Can I say, though, that the fundamental point is that people remember the fact that Christina was the head of one of the most unpopular governments, unsuccessful governments in New South Wales history, but also they remember the fact that the reason that Nathan Rees was dumped was because Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi decided they wanted someone else, and that was her. And are you really asserting that she would not have been Premier without Eddie Obeid and Joe Tripodi's support?
It was a decision of the caucus.
It was a decision of the caucus, but it was a decision where you know full well.
No, but I was in the state caucus for 18 glorious months or something like that.
But seriously though, it's
when I was there when Obeid, the first caucus meeting I went to was when he was thrown out of the front bench.
And Sam Dastyari himself belled the cat when he revealed to Kate McClymont the fact that they were so close.
The second edition.
It's interesting you raise that. Kate McClymont's quite clear that.
No, I've seen and I've read the full text. You've got to read to the end of the paragraph to get that.
But the fundamental point that Christine was denying.
Now we can talk about this all night. It's probably what a lot of people are talking about. We might not come back to it. Anthony?
Look, I've 11 polling places now.
Okay.
So it's roughly, the graphics, I won't do the graphics on this one, but that's about 12%, 12% of the vote. What you're seeing is that the Liberal vote, first preference is down 6, the Labor is up 7. Now, that's a comparison with of polling places. If you could project that onto the first preferences from last time, you get the Liberals on 44 and Labor on 35. The Liberals will not lose if they have the high first preference vote, and there's nothing which is showing the gap under 6 or 7% at this stage. Now, it is quite a low turnout for given there's 11 polling places, but at this stage, we can talk about the after preferences count, but the fact the Liberal Party vote looks certain to be ahead on the first preferences is a strong indication the Liberals should be able to hold the seat.
Is that what your scrutiny is, Trent?
Well, I'm just looking at the figures that I'm being provided in Eastwood West, which is an area with a large Chinese community. We have figures for which show that there's a two-party preferred swing of about 2%. So that's one where there's a big Chinese community.
Okay. Tony?
If we're not getting better swings than that in places like Eastwood West, then it's very, very hard for us to win the seat. It was always hard for us to win the seat. Let's not pretend anything other than that. And I said that right at the start of the program. But let's see as this unfolds.
You want to have bigger swings. You'd like to have bigger swings. Let's go to Lucy Carter, who's with the Labor camp in Ryde. And as the early figures come in, the crowd is building. I don't know, Lucy, if you can hear the sense of what's going on here. Not a huge swing at the moment. What's the feeling there?
Well, I can tell you, Bridge, that there's actually 3 televisions in the room, and all of them are glued onto your coverage.
Excellent.
And certainly, as those early results have been, coming through, there have been a few muted cheers for certain polling booths and some of the big swings seen. But I'd say that there have been a few smiles wiped off faces as it's become, I suppose, increasingly evident that perhaps this swing is not going to be big enough for Christina Keneally to pick up the seat of Bennelong. The crowd here is building. There are a huge number of volunteers that have been working on the ground for Labor throughout Bennelong, and certainly all of them are standing around watching the televisions, but the mood has definitely shifted from an hour or so ago when there really was a lot of hope that Christina Keneally could do the impossible.
Okay, Lucy, thank you. We'll come back to you. Let's go back to our... before we go to our Canberra Bureau, Greg Jennett's going to come in. Anthony Green, we've got some more.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. We might as well do the graphics. Now we've got the numbers. So let's have a look at the numbers. We've now got 14.9% counted. John Alexander on 43.6, Christina Keneally on 35.4. Let's look at the change in first preference vote that's occurring there. The Liberal vote down 5.9, the Labor Party up 6.3. So those figures are settling down now. I think we now have 5 or I'm not quite sure how many polling places with a preference count. Let's have a look here. I've got 5, still 5. It's slightly higher, it's now 3.7% the swing. So Liberal Party on 56. So that's at the bottom range of some expectations of the swing, and certainly far better result for the Liberal Party than the opinion polling was indicating. Again, there's more counting to come, but everything's indicating the Liberal Party should be able to hold the seat because that gap on first preferences is just too big to close given the minor party vote that's on the count.
Let's go to Canberra as well, and we'll bring Greg Jennett in. Greg, you would have just heard what Anthony said. What sort of swing do you think that the parties will be pleased with and disappointed with?
Look, I think there's a bit of something for everyone here as these numbers start to settle down. A swing of 3 to 4% for the Labor Party will give it the ability to say that it fielded a credible candidate, have pushed this seat from the roughly 10%, 9% range down to 4 or 5-ish, might be the current estimate. So they'll feel that it's back in play, arguably, at the next general election. Now, whether Christina Keneally would be a candidate under that scenario, we can only guess, I suppose, at the moment. But crucially for the government, the retention of the seat itself. So, look, Labor wouldn't come away disgraced by a result like this, not by any means, and you'd have to think Christina Keneally would herself be worth a few points to the campaign and to the party generally. So that's okay. Also, it looks like there's probably some expression of independent thought and voting will here by the voters of Bennelong. I think your panel earlier, Bridget, was observing that there was not much interest at all in accepting how to vote tickets outside of the ballot booths today. Now, if that was a widespread phenomenon, then clearly people have gone in and voted around the ticket as they please, which is, it might also account for why Labor's primary vote looked pretty good at the start of these figures coming in, but then people have found their will and their way through the ballot, and it just hasn't translated across to the 2PP result.
Yeah, Greg. Trent Zimmerman, what do you make of these early results? You'd be unhappy with them?
I'm naturally a cautious person. I mean, it's obviously better than the alternative at this stage, but we still have some very big booths to come in, so I'm still holding judgment until we've seen some more.
OK. Tony Burke?
Oh, so far, if the trends so far hold, we're going to fall short. What we are seeing is a significant improvement on the Labor vote. We are dealing with a by-election where the incumbent contests, and this will, we haven't had many of those by-elections, but this will probably be the first time we've had one, I suspect, where the incumbent has gone backwards when they've recontested a by-election. It's an unusual situation.
Anthony Green's laughs.
From a prior sample of 2. So.
Yep.
Out of 150
and one of those samples was a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, that's right.
One of them was a couple of weeks ago, and the other one was in Sydney. So in terms of what's happening here, to have an incumbent as the candidate is without a doubt an advantage. You've had all those years there in the electorate, and yet in a by-election he's going backwards.
OK. More updates, I think, from Anthony?
Yes. No, I think I've got, let me have a look at my numbers. I've got 15 polling places on first preferences. So there we are with 20% of the vote counted, as you can see there. 42.7 for John Alexander, Christine Keneally, the Labor Party 36.5, the Greens 7.5, their vote is down. The Conservative Party, Australian Conservatives 4.6, the Christian Democrats 3.1, and everyone else trails away under that. Let's look at that change in vote again. Liberal vote down 5.8, Labor vote up 6.4. Once these trend figures settle down, they don't tend to shift because you're just weighting extra data with roughly the same swing. You don't see big swings from booth to booth. Let's look at the 2 candidate preferred that's occurring here. We've now got 6 of the 39 polling places, and the swing is at 3.7%. So I think that's the figure I had earlier. But at this stage, there's no particular indication the swing is anything like this required that would defeat the Liberal Party in that electorate. And the analysis of the first preference votes, which is more progressed than the preference count, would indicate the Liberal Party are holding the seat of Bennelong.
Okay. Tony, but both sides were going into this, were in the last couple of days, were saying, look, we think it's going to be tight and John Alexander likely to get over the line. What sort of swing, you know, if you would have liked us, if it's 4 or 5%, what sort of swing do you think is still a victory, so to speak, for you?
Oh, well, I mean, as I said the day that this was called, and yeah, Andy says it's a sample of two. One of them's in Sydney. The other that we now have is in New England. When an incumbent recontests, there is a massive advantage, and it's fundamentally different to when you've got two people, neither of whom have a history of being the local member of parliament in an electorate. So yeah, we're on a swing at the moment. Which your latest figure, Anthony, on the two-party preferred was?
It's got up to 5.2 suddenly. I've got a couple of extra polling places in on preferences. I've got Carlingford, two Eastwoods, Macquarie Park, the Epping Boys High polling place. But the change in first preference, I haven't got the change in figures, but it's still 5%. That's still well short. And,
so this was a by-election, not where the locals were told that, oh, look, you can have a swing at the government and it won't make a difference. This is a by-election where people were told the government will lose its majority. And they've still voted in these sorts of numbers, which is enough at a general election that would be a shift of 24 seats.
But doesn't that also show that if they're being told the government can lose their majority, that, you know...
They didn't want that to happen,
that's
that
right.
seems.
Well, no, enough wanted it to happen that if you had this happen across the country, it'd be a change of 24 seats.
Yeah.
That's also true.
But can I say, though, that I think that trying to draw an analogy between Bennelong and New England is a very long bow. In New England, the Labor Party wasn't fielding a candidate. There was not an alternate candidate to the Deputy Prime Minister who had nearly the resources that Labor has thrown at this seat. And you do see a swing against an incumbent where suddenly the alternate party is resourcing a campaign like never before. And not since 2007 have the Labor Party run as serious a campaign in Bennelong as they have over the last 5 weeks. They obviously had a very high-profile candidate. And combined with that, you had what I think was some, putting it mildly, mischievous messaging that was simply not factually true about healthcare and about education. And all of that, as we saw in the last federal election, was designed to scare voters, and that undoubtedly has an impact.
The Liberal Party ran harder in this by-election than they ran in Bennelong in a general election as well, though.
But an incumbent has that advantage. What I'm saying is that you ran a campaign like never seen before in this seat, and it would be natural for your vote to increase in those circumstances, particularly when voters are being bombarded with those messages designed to scare them.
I think the Liberal Party ran harder than they've run in the seat
I think
as well.
we can. I think it's fair to say that both feel that there's been scare messages done on both sides. But we'll come back to it. I keep saying this. We're going to go to Stephen Jedgetts, who's at the Liberal headquarters in Ryde, where the room is filling up. Well, I think so. We can't see that too many people behind you. But Stephen, what's the feeling there?
Bridget, just in the last maybe 10 minutes or so, the mood has really shifted here at Liberal HQ. There was a palpable sense of relief flooding through the room when some of those larger booths started to come through. The feeling here now, obviously, is that the Liberal Party, although it will suffer a swing against it, is going to be in a position most likely to hold the seat. And for people who were staring down the barrel of what they saw as an unlikely but possible catastrophic defeat, that's an immense relief indeed.
OK, Stephen, we'll check back in as a few more people gather. Just before we go to a news update, I'll just see if Anthony has anything more to add.
We can just update the graphics again. I've now got that bigger 5% swing figure available. So we've got 23.4% counted there. As you can see, those are the numbers we're seeing as percentages at this stage. Projected percentages. Look at the change in vote that's occurring at this electorate. We're seeing the Liberal vote down 6, Labor up 6.4. So we're still in that switch of 6% between the major parties. And some of the swing that's not translating into 6% is coming because the Conservative vote has increased and the Green vote has fallen, which has caused the net change in the preference flows. If you look at the two candidate preferred, That's translating into 5.2%, and that's with 8 polling places reporting. So that's 5.2%. Again, that's still well short of 11 of the sort of 9.7. But I'm sure the Labor Party would be pleased that it's gone up on the last update.
Okay.
Keep them moving up.
Out of my hand.
When we get to 50%, I think we'll have a more certain indication.
Yeah, what are we up to now? 11 out of
25%, I think.
I might be able to tell you which extra booths came in. I was still not publishing online, so I still can't see it. But
4. There's 39, so when we're roughly at about 20.
The extra figures came in. The Macquarie Park, there's 10% swing. Eastwood St George's Anglicans a 10% swing, and Carlingford Public's 12% after preferences. So they're the ones that have come in that have boosted that swing. So they're all up at that end of the election.
It's a real mixed bag. Yeah.
But once again, there has been a shift in people of Chinese heritage. Now, how do you break that down? Hong Kong, mainland China, we won't be able to get that sort of data, but there is no doubt what Labor lost in a swing against us at the last election has come back tonight.
So you think, while Trent, the Liberals will be going, phew, and Malcolm Turnbull, you're obviously thinking, looking ahead, that you're in a much better position.
Oh, that's right. And from our perspective, this by-election in so many ways is different to any other by-election that we've had. I presume we've never had one where the outcome meant a government could lose its majority. And that means people largely had the chance to vote as they would in a general election.
We're yet to see some of those big booths in the Chinese areas, like Eastwood itself and Epping, come in. But what is striking to me is that in the traditional Labor areas of the electorate, places like Ryde, the swings are actually the smallest, and that would seem to me to indicate that Bill Shorten and Christina Keneally are not appealing to traditional Labor voters.
The swing swap, but you got less room to move.
Okay,
we're still 50% plus.
We're going to get a news update at the moment. You're watching our continuing coverage of the Bennelong by-election. Very early results are showing a small swing to Labor, but not enough for Christina Keneally to win. We'll be bringing you up to the minute details in results as they occur. But now let's get some of the day's other news.
Hello, Nina Mairata with an ABC News update. 3 people have been taken to hospital with minor injuries after a Manly ferry and yacht collided near Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour. 2 people were thrown from this yacht during the collision with the Narrabeen about 2:30 this afternoon. It was towed into Rushcutters Bay with a broken mast, and the ferry returned to its circular quay. Police say it's too early in the investigation to say who was at fault.
Police are currently investigating the matter. Both the master of the yacht and the ferry were breath tested with a negative result.
There were 14 people on the yacht at the time. The Vatican has issued its first response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission into the sexual abuse of children, saying they need to be studied seriously. The Commission found that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children were sexually abused in the nation's institutions. The report has shone a light on the human impact of the decades of abuse.
Richard Jabara was 13 when he was raped by a priest in a seminary.
My grades began to fall at school. I didn't achieve the kind of levels that I used to. I was always a top student. And then it just keeps going on and on in life.
Help came in time for Mr. Jabara.
And thankfully, I got intervention and I was able to not kill myself. But the thoughts are still there with me all the time.
But for others, the true toll may never be known.
A lot of people who are not here today killed themselves because what these priests did.
In its 17-volume report, the Royal Commission writes, child sexual abuse in institutions is likely to have affected at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children over the past decades. The cost of child sexual abuse to the Australian economy is difficult to quantify, but it is likely to be in the billions of dollars each year. 8,000 people gave evidence in private sessions. 2/3 were men. More than 14% were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. 10% were in prison at the time they testified.
There is 2 types of things that happen to you if you're a survivor of abuse. One is you either become compliant or you become a rebel.
The National Redress Scheme excludes many convicted offenders from claiming compensation.
They actually need to pay them as well, some sort of recompense. Don't abuse them again. Don't say you're a bad boy again or you're a naughty child.
The Royal Commission's final report gives deeply personal insights into how survivors are faring. Almost a fifth said they had suicidal thoughts. 16% said they'd attempted suicide. A fifth reported relationship problems, and almost a half said they had difficulties with trust and intimacy. Hetty Johnson says we're now at a crossroads and much is at stake for survivors.
There is a feeling of intense anxiety and fear and apprehension that all of this hope and all of this trust is about to be betrayed again if these governments right across the country don't implement these recommendations.
The chair of the Royal Commission says the problems faced by all those who were abused are the responsibility of our entire society. Philippa McDonald, ABC News.
A strong earthquake has struck off the coast of Java in Indonesia, killing at least 2 people. The magnitude 6.5 quake struck close to midnight local time, and it was felt 200 kilometres away in the capital, Jakarta. The powerful tremors lasted nearly 30 seconds in some areas, resulting in extensive damage to buildings in Western Java. The Blue Mountains Council says it has strong community support as it fights off a possible suspension over allegations of asbestos mismanagement. The council held an extraordinary meeting last night, 2 days after the state government issued it with a notice of intent to suspend it. Safe Work New South Wales is inspecting 20 sites nominated as asbestos hotspots, and a preschool has been closed. The council admits there have been problems but says it's dealing with the issue as directed.
I will do anything the government needs us to do to get this scourge under control in our city. And on the basis of my willingness to do that, there is no reason to suspend democracy in the Blue Mountains.
The council has decided not to pursue legal action against the state government. A permanent memorial to the victims of the Lindt Cafe siege in Sydney has been unveiled on the 3rd anniversary of the terrorist attack. The cafe's manager, Tori Johnson, and lawyer Katrina Dawson were killed when Harun Monis held them and 16 other people hostage in December 2014.
Sunflowers for Tori Johnson and hydrangeas for Katrina Dawson.
Their names will always live on here in the heart of our city and our nation.
Families and survivors joined in an emotional tribute in Martin Place, some even managing to find a smile on a dark day. 3 years ago today, this was where the last deadly hours of the standoff unfolded, leaving 2 hostages dead and 15 traumatised survivors.
It's just a very special day for Tori and Katrina, and on a day like today, it's just brings back all the terrible memories of that awful day.
The memorial features 210 handcrafted flowers set into mirrored boxes. The design was inspired by the hundreds of thousands of flowers that were laid in Martin Place in the following days, a remarkable outpouring of national grief.
It's a great way to remember how the community got together around that time, people from all walks of life.
It was a sad day for Sydney and Australia, but I think it's being memorialised really nicely here.
It'll be just a really moving tribute to 2 very fine Australians who should not have lost their lives.
Already, new tributes are being left on the memorial, a sign of its mark on our national memory. Kathleen Calderwood, ABC News, Martin Place.
Prince Harry will marry his fiancée Meghan Markle on 19th May next year. The couple announced their engagement last month and said the service will be held at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The wedding is scheduled for the same day as the FA Cup final and presents a potential conflict for Prince William, who would normally attend the match as president of the English Football Association. And that's the latest news update from me. Now it's back to you, Bridget.
Nina. And of course now we're going to go straight back to Anthony Green. We've got some updated info, and can you call it?
Great, we've got the great latest figures coming across, and at the moment 27.8% counted. We're continuing to see that gap It's about 6.5% there on the first preferences. Smattering of votes with the other candidates there, 7.3 for the Greens, combined 8% there with the two Conservatives and Christian Democrat candidates. When we look at the change in first preference votes, quite consistently 6% either way on first preference shift. There's no way that hasn't shifted now for nearly 15% of the count. So that's absolutely clearly what the trend is. When we look at the two candidate preferred, we're seeing a 5% swing. And with, I think that's 12 polling places, I'm quite happy to call that with 5% as the swing at this stage. I think we go on to we have, I haven't got the final page to show John Alexander elected at this stage, but I'll set that off so it will work. But there's a 5% swing. There's no sign of a swing larger than that or significantly larger than that, which would endanger the Liberal Party holding the seat, and John Alexander will be re-elected.
OK, we might even try and go back to Stephen Jedgetts at the Liberal Party headquarters, but first to you, Trent Zimmerman.
Well, I'm very encouraged by those results. I did honestly think it was going to be closer. So if we end up with a 5% swing, which is on average for by-elections, then I think that's a very strong outcome for the government.
Tony Burke, 5% swing. Liberals, John Alexander holds it.
Oh, then yeah, that's what it's certainly looking like. If the government's view out of tonight is this is a strong result for the government, then they will go away having heard no message, having received no message from the people. And we are talking about a by-election where the people were told by the Prime Minister that he would lose his majority if they lost the seat, and enough people switched that would wipe out the government in a general election. That's what's happened here. And so the only accident of history the government's got tonight is that this by-election has happened in a 9% seat. But this is a sort of swing that Peter Dutton would be obliterated if a swing like this was on. Christian Porter would be gone. There's a whole series of very prominent government members who aren't even members of Parliament if a swing that's anything like this happens at a general election. And at this by-election they were told what it was going to be about.
I'm sure Malcolm Turnbull's very relieved, though, right at this point.
I think he would be, and I think that Tony is trying to spin this as a favourable outcome for the Labor Party. But
you'd never do that.
If you look at, of course not.
Not for the Labor Party, no, you wouldn't.
No, certainly not. But if you look at by-election history, the volatility in by-elections is always greater than a general election. And I would just remind Tony that in my own seat there was a swing of more than we're seeing here, and in Canning a few weeks before there was a swing of 6.5%. And yet the government went on to win the general election. So I think you've really got to be looking at the type of thing that's happened in this area before, right at the state level, for example, where there was a swing of around 20%, same day that Cabramatta did the same. That was a precursor to a government being in trouble.
OK, let's go back to Canberra to National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett. Some will say the voice of reason here. Greg Jennett, no surprises here. Both sides are very happy with this result. What do you make?
Yeah, I'll take that, Bridget. I'll be the voice of reason any night of the week. Look, at 7:47, goodness knows how far and wide senior ministers of the Turnbull government are around this vast nation of ours tonight. But at 7:47, when Anthony Green predicted that this is a seat retained by the Liberal Party, I think you could almost hear the groans of relief coming from those senior ministers who, we've noted already in our coverage, put in a fair amount of work to assist John Alexander in his campaign. And what it also means, of course, is that they are back to 76 members of the House of Representatives. So what that brings is a sense of renewal and renewed purpose, I suppose, when the Parliament reconvenes for the year in February next year. At least some of the uncertainties will be removed from the Parliament generally, but you'd have to think particularly from the government side of the chamber, because with that 76th vote, it can now fend off the likes of Tony Burke moving motions in the House of Reps to collectively refer 9 MPs off to the High Court of Australia. Now, I'll go out and predict that we may yet hear debate on the floor of the chamber about the seats of Braddon, about Longman, possibly about Chisholm, and obviously the seat of Batman is still in question as well, as far as by-elections that may loom next year. We can talk further about that later if you want, Bridget,
Well,
but
no, I just want
relief
you-
at least in the first instance.
I want you to stay there, and I don't know if we can bring Greg up, because now, of course, now that you've said that, Tony Burke sitting here, busting to say something about those seats. You know, it does mean for Malcolm Turnbull that Greg is right. You know, in the sense that your efforts to try and have your motion again next year of sort of, they're going to be harder for you.
Oh, that's right. I mean, don't forget, sometimes I win votes on the floor just because government members don't turn up. And we've had a few of those, so I don't rule that out. But
less and less frequently. We're learning to be disciplined.
We had one last week.
I think Malcolm Turnbull's going to make sure that everyone is there.
Yeah, he says that every time.
But as you know, that was because of genuine misadventure, Tony.
But just bringing Greg Jennett back, what does this mean, do you think, for Bill Shorten now? You know, a 5% swing. John Alexander's held the seat.
Look, there's no downside for Bill Shorten in this. As we said earlier, Bridget, I think each side can take a little something, you know, a valiant effort with a high-profile candidate that pulls a swing of 5%, and who knows what happens at the next general election. But if the current national polls were to be believed, there'd be nothing to preclude Labor pulling another 5% at a general election. Some of them show a split which is enormous, to say the least, on a national two-party preferred basis. So, look, they can come away from this with some bragging rights, as I'm sure they will, Bridget, but the momentum that I think the government will take out of this will be more pronounced, though, because this has not been a comfortable 2017 for the coalition. They felt that a few things started to click for them in the last parliamentary week of the year. Then came Barnaby Joyce, now comes John Alexander, and I think in politics momentum does count for a lot. Now, whether that is disrupted by the summer slumber, we'll have to wait and see. But at year's end, I think the government will take this one, and Bill Shorten can say, you know, valiant result there.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Bridget, I wouldn't be quite so charitable as Greg's being, I have to say. It's this was after all the campaign that was launched by Bill Shorten, where he introduced Christina Keneally as the next member for Bennelong, confidence that they would win this seat, followed by a year of saying that this government was in crisis and unelectable, and then to have this result where you've basically got an average swing, I think is going to mean that Bill Shorten's going to be very nervous if there is a by-election in Batman in Melbourne early in the new year. The contest will be different against the Greens, but it certainly wouldn't give him any confidence that he's going to be able to hold that seat.
This is a swing that would wipe out the government.
But as I pointed out to you, you know full well that swings in by-elections do not reflect the outcome of general elections.
Yeah, you're talking about swings where the incumbent doesn't contest. You're talking about swings where the key message to the people is you can vote whichever way you want and it won't make a difference to who's in government and how the parliament operates. None of that applied this time. But don't get me wrong. If the takeout from the Liberal Party tonight is jubilation and they haven't heard the message, I'm not going to get in the way of that.
I think there's messages in every by-election, and that's obviously something we'll have to sit down and do, and we have to listen to the voters in Bennelong. But to suggest that after all of the Labor's rhetoric about how this was going to be a seat that Christina Keneally was going to win, a huge endorsement for Bill Shorten, and then to have a 5% swing, it shows that there was not a mood in the electorate. And at the end of the day, that's judged by 50% plus one. There's not an mood in the electorate to see this government fall short of having a majority in the parliament.
OK, just before you jump in there, I'm going to go back to Anthony Green with some more.
We'll just update the figures. The figures are continuing to roll in. And if we look at the first preferences, we've now got 35% of the vote counted, just under 43 for John Alexander, Christina Keneally 36, the Greens 7.5. Conservatives just under 5%, the Christian Democrats on 3%. Let's look at that change in votes that's occurring on these numbers, sticking at that 6% shift between the first preferences. And again, some of that not translating into swing is caused by the shift in the minor party vote from left to right, from the Greens to Conservative parties. Let's look at the two-party preferred, and then we'll go on to look at who we're declaring as winning. The swing has come down to 4.3%. We're predicting the Liberals will have 55.4 at the end of the count. And we're saying that on the graphic, on the trends we're seeing so far, we can call this election result and we're seeing that John Alexander will be elected as the member for. We're not seeing it, so here we are. John Alexander has been elected as the member for Bennelong, or re-elected.
There you go.
And Bridget, can I make the obvious point that with so many people postal voting and so many people pre-polling, none of those figures are obviously going to be with us tonight before this broadcast ends. Pre-poll normally favours the Liberal Party in Bennelong by about 3.5%. Postal voting favours the Liberal Party over the electorate-wide result by about 5%. So those trends were to continue, then it would mean that firstly the votes in some of these booths was being suppressed by virtue of the fact that so many people did postal vote. But secondly, at the end of the day, when those are counted, the swing will be even less.
Does this now mean that John Alexander really can't retire? He's going to have to contest that at the next
I think
election.
John Alexander's a hero for the Liberal Party tonight, and he should be, because it's been a tough campaign, and he's been a great local member, a great parliamentarian, and he deserves this outcome.
Tony, but is this a repudiation of Bill Shorten?
No, not at all. And can I first, because it's the first chance I've had properly now that the screen's up, and it's for other people to formally concede, but presuming Anthony Green is right, which on this panel you're not allowed to say anything but that.
He's never been wrong, have you, Anthony? No?
Have you ever been wrong?
Only once when I was getting bad data, and I was only slightly wrong. I didn't pick the wrong winner, I just got the margin wrong.
But anyway, presuming that, then it's certainly congratulations to John Alexander, presuming that's the case. There are two stories. Well, there are two stories out of tonight. In terms of for the Labor Party, I do think the argument is absolutely compelling that you cannot see this as an ordinary by-election.
Yeah, and I think you would agree on that, and it's
been an extraordinary by-election.
So to say,
but it's not a normal by-election.
There was more at stake, and this is a swing that wouldn't just see the government defeated if it were across the board. It'd be absolutely annihilated if this swing happens. So there's a lot of space if in a general election you say, by-election, there's a bit of buffer. There's a lot of space here. But the other story that comes out of tonight is the significant shift that is coming through in those booths with significant Chinese and Korean populations. And if the government thinks that is only off the back of comments that were made in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, they'll be wrong. And the members for Banks, for Reid and for Chisholm should be looking at these results pretty carefully, because the outcome for them, if this is what is now happening in Sydney and you can presume Melbourne, then there's some Liberals in real trouble out of tonight.
But can I say though that, I mean, if those figures are right, and there are mixed results. So for example, Epping, big Chinese community area, shows a very small swing at the Epping booth. But you have to remember that these results come at what was at the end of a disgraceful campaign, personally targeting the Prime Minister, effectively accusing him of being a racist. When you were talking about a Prime Minister who has done nothing other than defend multiculturalism as one of our country's great achievements, whose own granddaughter has Chinese heritage. Okay. And then you saw that disgraceful campaign being run against him, which I think has no place, frankly, in politics from a major political party.
I must respond. I'll be as brief as I can, because I know you want to get back to outcomes. I want to deal with two issues that were raised. One in terms of I'm not going to comment on members of the Prime Minister's family, obviously. But the argument of, it reminds me of arguments in other areas of prejudice where someone defends themselves on the basis they say, but some of my best friends are like that. You need a better argument than that. And I just don't accept you can claim that the Prime Minister has been this champion of multiculturalism when citizenship laws changes were introduced to the Parliament, which said that if you come from Great Britain, you don't need to pass a university level English test. But if you come here from China or Korea, you do need to pass a university level English test. If you come from America or Canada, you don't. If you come from any part of Asia or Africa, you do. Now, maybe the Prime Minister will claim he hadn't looked at that in detail, but these communities have looked at it in detail. And I just don't see how you can argue that someone can be a champion of multicultural Australia when you've got policies like that.
I think you have to look at what the Prime Minister has said and done while he has been Prime Minister, and he has been a champion of multiculturalism. And I think in relation to citizenship, trying to conflate those two issues when the government was simply saying that if you take out citizenship of our great country, that you should have a proficiency, a competent level of English, not at academic level, but as a general test under those international rules, that is unreasonable. And I think that that is a misstated point.
You only have to do it if you came from certain countries.
But the point I come back to, though, and I don't think it's easily brushed aside, I mean, effectively saying that the Prime Minister is holding views which are discriminatory against his own family members, I think is quite personally insulting.
But overall, from what you've been saying, Trent, the 22 opinion polls have had Labor ahead of Liberals. So are you coming from it from the point of view that if the electorate was really unhappy with the government, we would have seen a much bigger swing and John Alexander would have been wiped out? But obviously you're saying it's not a normal by-election, so you can't do that.
But we've seen in the past, and as I said earlier, at the state level in this very area, when there was a precursor to a government losing office, you saw swings of far greater magnitude. I think in Ryde's case, 18 to 20% at the state level. We haven't seen that here. Now, of course, the polling is tight at the moment, and we'd prefer to be on the positive side than on the negative side of that polling. But I don't believe that a swing of this magnitude, which is a lot less than a lot of pundits predicted, is a precursor to the government being in fatal trouble.
It is going to make Bennelong a marginal seat, you know, with that swing, or certainly a tighter seat and harder for you to hold on to at a general election. So does it also then show that this argument about Christina Keneally and her links to Eddie Obeid, has the electorate moved on? Is 6 years, you know, is that enough? Maybe they've moved on from it. You know, she has had a significant swing to her.
But I don't think that you'll forget. I think you're underestimating the impact of Labor's scare campaign, which was quite dishonest, where basically you had Labor Party and their union allies telling people that their funding for their local schools was going to be slashed under our government, when of course the reverse is true. Every school in Bennelong gets a funding increase next year. When you saw the rerun of those Mediscare campaigns, when bulk billing actually increased under our government in Bennelong, then you're obviously going to have a negative reaction. That type of campaigning does work. So to have survived that onslaught from the 8 unions that were involved supporting Christina Keneally, I think is a significant achievement.
But Tony Boot, do you think it shows that in New South Wales that people have moved on from Eddie Obeid and the Labor of old? You know, is this good for state Labor, for New South Wales Labor?
I think it also says that people never associated Christina Keneally with it, and that there is no stronger defence than to say, I gave the evidence that locked these people up. Like, there's no stronger defence than that. And so I don't see how the Liberal Party talk about having run issues like that and then say, oh, but Labor ran a smear. I mean, really.
Anthony?
But she didn't do anything when it counted, and that's when they were running the state.
Well, they weren't running the state.
In fact, she reappointed Ian McDonald to the ministry.
She was the premier. She was the premier. But you tried running this argument during the by-election. We've still got a big enough swing that you'd be wiped out of the general election. If it looks like you've won tonight, as Anthony has said, then congratulations on the basis of that. And if you think there's no messages to take away from it, go for it.
I think there's messages for both. OK, Anthony, can you jump in here?
Well, we'll just run through the numbers again, because the numbers are continuing to update. We now have 26 first preference booths and 22 after preferences booths. That's a 40% count. John Alexander just under 43, Christina Keneally 36.3, Greens 7.5 and 7 8, about 8%, 4.8 with Conservatives, 3.1 with Christian Democrats. When we look at the change in first preference votes, the same picture we've seen all night, 6.2 versus 6.7. So once you take the swing, when we convert that to 2 candidate preferred, which takes account of the preference flows and likes for the smaller parties, the preference swing, the swing is 4.7%. The Liberal Party to win with 55%. And again, we'll declare John Alexander as the winner, as a winner of the Bennelong by-election and re-elected to Parliament.
Now, I think we're going to try and go... Is Stephen Jedgetts available yet? No, he's not. You ready? He's at the Liberal Party headquarters. Apparently there's been some cheering.
Maybe the dance floor's been moved to...
The dance floor. They'll be dancing anyway. You know, really.
At the Liberal Party? Yeah.
No, at Christina Keneally's camp.
You guys are doing line dancing or something.
She likes to dance.
Christina?
Yeah.
I have never danced with her, I have to say.
Yeah. John, does she like a dance? Yeah, I think so.
I don't know the answer. I'd be facing the piano.
She likes well, you know what she does like? She does like a sing-along, because I remember during the 2011 campaign, state campaign, she was on the bus with a fellow ABC reporter, Mark Tobin. He was on the guitar and Christina was singing. She had a good voice. I'm not sure if John Alexander has a good voice. Beg your pardon?
I hope Gladys never does that. That would be considered a crime against humanity. Sorry, Gladys.
There's the lady.
Oh, you're going to get us
Yeah. For those viewers in the other state, Trent Zimmerman's talking about Gladys Berejiklian, the New South Wales Premier, who he's friends with. So
Was friends with.
Was friends with, that's right. And we're looking at pictures, obviously, of the Christina Keneally camp. Hopefully they'll be watching and they can yell out, "Are you all on the dance floor there?" They'll be getting ready. Anthony, do you want to update us with anything?
Oh, there's nothing particularly. I mean, the numbers, there's a tendency to keep looking at the numbers, but these are numbers which correct from where it's from. They do not change much once you've got this many polling places in. There's nothing there in any of these polling places that are to come which is going to change the result. The only thing that will change these results is what happens with the pre-polls, where there's a massive number. I think it's 15,000 and 13,000 postals which are counted next week. So that's the only thing that's going to change this swing, and none of those are going to change the result.
OK. Let's go now to Stephen Jedgetts, who's at the Liberal headquarters in Ryde. Oh, I can hear it, Stephen. Anthony Green has called the election in favour of John Alexander. I can hear what the feeling is there. What's it like?
That's right, Bridget. It's just outright ebullience here at Liberal HQ. It was initially a wave of relief that swept across the room, and now people are officially in party mode. I just saw the first glass of champagne handed over about 20 minutes or so ago. There's a feeling in here that really John Alexander, considering the circumstances, did pretty well. Now, Labor's been very quick to point out that if this swing was replicated across the state, the coalition would still be on track for a heavy defeat. But the people here don't really care. They thought today would be very, very close. And as it is, it looks like the swing, as you said, isn't going to be enough, not nearly enough, to unseat John Alexander. And so people here will take this win, and they'll take it with a smile on their face.
When are you expecting John Alexander to appear, and also, I'm assuming, the Prime Minister?
Yeah, we haven't yet had official word that the Prime Minister's coming. I think that probably depended on the result, but given John Alexander has held on, I think we will see the Prime Minister before too long. That's just a guess, but there's every indication of that. At the moment, John Alexander, we're told, will make an appearance sometime before too long. We just don't have a time as yet. But I tell you what, if the last 10 minutes is anything to go by, he will receive a rapturous welcome. I think the people here were aware that he was all that stood between the coalition and disaster. And so you imagine he'll get about as good a greeting as a man can get who's suffered a 5% swing against him.
OK. Stephen, we'll come back to you. Stand by when you hear more about John Alexander's arrival, obviously. Let's just go back to our Canberra Bureau, International Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett. Greg, we're all assuming that the Prime Minister's going to be turning up there. An early Christmas present for him?
I think it would be a temptation too difficult for Malcolm Turnbull to resist. Bridget, a quick trip across the city of Sydney, not very far at all really, to get into the heart of Bennelong this evening. He did just that for the New England by-election and Barnaby Joyce a couple of weeks ago, so I think it's perfectly reasonable to anticipate that the Prime Minister will in fact want to show up. I can't confirm that he is or that he isn't, but your expectation would be that he would want to revel in this moment with his candidate John Alexander, if for no other reason than it puts a line in the sand, really, at the end of this political year. I mean, that said, there are a couple of other things that are expected to happen before the year completely wraps up. One is the release of a budget update, and the other is some uncertainty about when there may be a need for a ministerial reshuffle, either this year or perhaps even early next year. So there are some other things to attend to before he can get into the real summer break, as indeed can most senior ministers in the government, particularly if there's a reshuffle on the cards before the end of this calendar year. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But look, just also, Bridget, on the what I think we might call the Burke thesis, the takeout that Tony Burke is getting. Why not?
You're the
any
voice,
title.
Burke thesis, and you're the voice of reason. You need a quote for Trent, Greg. It's unfair. You've got to be balanced.
Yeah, no, I'll come up with something.
Zimmernomics.
We'll come up with something for Trent, but just this idea that because there might have been offence caused to sections of the Bennelong community, it might cause a government to rethink its tactics and strategies. That would pose some difficulties for the nation, I think, when you're looking at the foreign interference package, which we've been talking about already this evening. As I understood it, most of the offence, if it was taken in the Bennelong by-election, was taken by people who were organs of Chinese influence and, in some cases, party donors. That is explained by that mysterious letter that arrived at one point in the latter weeks of the campaign itself. So I think as a nation you would not want to see governments going into retreat on advancing these packages of national security protections, really, if it thought that it didn't pass some electoral test in a seat like Bennelong or in a neighbouring one like Banks. You would hope from a kind of national interest perspective that the Parliament could actually rise above that. I know politics gets very dirty sometimes, but you would hope that on these bigger questions where offence can be caused, clearly it has been in Beijing
The
with the
Burke
Foreign
thesis
Ministry.
wants to throw something to you, Greg.
Sorry, Greg,
go right ahead.
if I may, if that's the Burke thesis, I will join you in condemning it. Because you're talking about national security laws which should never be dealt with in the way that you just described.
It's typical of Labor to disown their own policies before the ink's even dry.
Well, no. In terms of national security, we do have a pretty serious bipartisan approach, and I don't think anyone would argue what Greg just put. There is what I've been referring to, though. There has been a very significant issue in multicultural communities as a result of the citizenship changes that the government has put forward, where people have seen a double standard where some countries have to pass a university level English test and other countries don't when they become citizens. It has been a huge issue, and the fact that it hasn't run big in the English-speaking media does not mean it's not out there, and it's not a very significant issue.
I do want to go back to Anthony, but quickly, what were you calling yourself? Zimmernomics?
Well, I think that the point that Greg makes is an important one, because we are talking about national security, and essentially what we saw over the last week was Labor trying to undermine what were perfectly responsible and reasonable proposals from the Prime Minister to stand up for our national interests in the face of what is quite clearly concerted efforts by foreign powers, not necessarily just China. We've seen what Russia's been up to in parts of Europe and the United States, but to implement laws that will try and protect Australia's interests from that type of interference. Yep. And that is perfectly reasonable. And what we saw from Labor's attacks was an attempt to castigate that type of response from the Prime Minister standing up for Australia as something that was wrong.
We did not. Sorry, Trent. And I'll take the political back and forth, but to imply in any way that we have come out against national security proposals is inaccurate.
Tony, the whole campaign for the last week, which was trying to bill the Prime Minister's response to this foreign interference as some way China-phobic, was born out of this issue, not citizenship. Your whole campaign in the final week was born out of the changes that we're proposing to national security laws.
There is nothing that we have said that is in any way critical of the national security proposals and preserving...
So you're trying to make a cake and eat it too?
No, I'm not. I'm not, because I've explained all the reasons why I think this government has let down multicultural Australia, and I've been doing it all night. But you're referring to a national security issue where both sides of politics have done very well in making sure we have a cooperative approach, in listening to the intelligence agencies and making sensible decisions on national security. And it would be irresponsible in the heat of a by-election campaign tonight to pretend that bipartisan approach on national security has been fractured.
But that's not the narrative. You can't reinvent
back,
history now that the
I'm
polls
just
are
going to go
closed.
to Anthony. When we come back, I want both of you to think about something that reflecting that maybe you could have done better rather than what you've both done. That's both of you have been fantastic, both sides. Just so you can have that thought. Anthony, let's go back to...
Oh, we're talking about winners and losers, and I thought one of the losers might be some of the pollsters and the money they earned from newspapers in this campaign, because they've all been some of them have been quite spectacularly wrong. There's been a huge shift in polling in recent years to robo-polls and automatic polling. And I think in an electorate like Bennelong, where there's a vast number of people who don't speak English as their first language, I think those sorts of polls are just not very accurate. Tony, I remember there were some really bad ones done in places like Blaxland and McMahon and Watson, completely wrong in 2013. And I think it's just simply, you can't use this sort of polling technique in an electorate where there's large numbers of people who don't speak English. You just don't get large parts of the electorate because they don't... You ring them up and ask them questions, they don't understand them. So I think that's something that's just... we may see fewer polls in these sorts of seats, because we saw 5 polls on one by-election in this campaign.
Okay. How significant is the swing for Labor? You know, from that sense of trying to compare it to a normal by-election, but, you know, in the sense, how significant do you think it is?
It's about 5%. I suspect it'll drift down a little bit from that, which would make it roughly the sort of average swing you see at a by-elections, roughly a little bit bigger than you see in the current state nationwide polls. So it's sort of both sides can look at that and say, well, this is the average swing and this is in the circumstances, and Labor can say, yeah, but your sitting members recontesting. It's one of those sorts of swings where perhaps a few people have written their analysis before the result was known based on opinion polls, and they're all going to have to go back and rewrite their analysis now based on the result, not on what was being reported beforehand.
And they'll be able to tune into these two to get that. But let's go now to Lucy Carter, who's at Labor's base in Ryde. Lucy, when are you expecting Christina Keneally tonight?
We haven't had any indication yet of when Christina Keneally will be arriving here, but I think it's fair to say that here at Camp Keneally they are out but not down. There's been a fairly extraordinary pivot from the Labor camp towards looking at this poll in the broader context of federal politics. We're getting a lot of messaging along the lines that if this result was repeated at a general election, how many seats would be wiped out from the coalition, how many ministers would lose their seats. So Labor is very clearly trying to spin this as a win, even if the swing towards Christina Keneally has not been as big as many people here would have hoped.
Well, Lucy, we'll hope to come back to you when Christina Keneally makes it. Thank you. And I just should tell you that as we were talking about Christina Keneally singing on the bus, she was singing Closer to Fine by Indigo Girls. There you go.
Impressive.
Yeah. She's up there. Like in 2011, Indigo Girls were doing well.
Maybe she can sing in the Senate.
Oh. So I want you two to reflect and not fight and admit something that, where the other side might have had a win. And I'll start it by her not declaring she's not going to run for the Senate.
I don't think there was any choice on that. I really don't.
But she could have said, no, I'm not running for the Senate. Like, she did have a choice.
Yeah, there's always a rule. The moment you contemplate anything other than a win, you're on terrible ground. And it's the same for leaders during campaigns when they're asked the question, what if you don't get there? It's just the moment you're on that territory, there's a reason why neither side ever does it. And that was a similar situation.
So what's something that, you think that the other side did do well? Is there anything?
I think when I heard Trent refer to the education funding issue, now Trent will disagree with what I'm about to say, but there's a compliment in there for you all the way through.
Backhanded.
Yes, I'm sure it'll be backhanded.
Which is the schools in the area are getting less money than what had previously been agreed with the New South Wales government. Year by year, it's more than they currently have, but in terms of what had previously been agreed, it's a cut. In explaining that cut, I think whenever you get in a conversation about the dollars, people's eyes glaze over. And for us, where education is a core issue, we're going to have to work our way through, I think, explaining not the dollars, because you just end up in a messy argument back and forth, but in very specifically what the difference is for the opportunities for a child. I've been looking at that really closely, and I was reminded by it when Trent came back with his response, which I don't agree with, but in the context of a debate, it's enough to mess it up.
Right. So you're saying that they won
in
the
education?
Or
Well,
they
I'm not saying.
it? Well, like,
I don't think we got as big an edge on education,
right?
As I certainly believe we deserve. We've got one of our best spokespeople in the area.
But is that also because at a state level, and a lot of education comes to the state level, the New South Wales Liberals have been very vocal about losing that money from their own federal counterparts? You know, is that...
I think partly, as long as the conversation's about the money, it's messy when you translate that money into the outcomes at the school. I think you're possibly in a very different conversation. We've wrestled with this right back to when we were in government, and we first provided the Gonski education money to explain what is a massive federal commitment, which has been substantially reduced, and explain it in terms of the outcomes for children. Is something that we're getting closer, but I don't think we've nailed.
Okay, Trent Zimmerman.
I'll just comment on Tonia's earlier point about Christina refusing to rule out running for the Senate. I mean, the reason that she didn't rule it out was because she's obviously contemplating it. And as soon as Sam Dastyari resigned, she had that at the back of her mind for basically the parachute out of Bennelong if she lost. And I think the problem that the Labor Party faced is that people saw through that. They realised that Christina was not running for Bennelong because she was interested in Bennelong. She was running for Bennelong because it was a strategy to get back into Parliament. And I don't think that voters were going to reward that. But in terms of the campaign,
is this your moment of self-reflection?
No, it's not. I would take a different tack on what Tony has said, and that I think that in some ways we didn't anticipate that there would be a rerun of the Mediscare campaign in this by-election, and we thought that after it was so discredited after the last federal election, it wouldn't be tried again. And I think there's a lesson in that for us about what Labor will be prepared to do.
Is Greg Jennett there in Canberra? Is Greg with us still in Canberra?
Still here,
Greg, you know, it was a really deeply personal campaign, and I'm assuming you would say on both parts. Is that... it's reasonably unusual, but how personal has it been compared to other by-elections or general elections, do you think?
Well, as an observer from afar, I would say willing. I'm not even sure I'd be using the word dirty. I mean, there were fringe players and stunts pulled. I think we saw media conferences disrupted. A lot of that's pretty pro forma these days in robust and willing campaigning, particularly with enthusiastic youngsters thrown into the mix. And both major parties employed a lot of volunteers and enthusiastic students, youth members from their wings, etc., were all involved heavily in what is an inner city by-election, completely different in character to, and we've said this earlier, New England and perhaps many of the others that we're contemplating possible by-elections for next year. For instance, in northern Tasmania, if we were to get there, Braddon would be of entirely different character, I would suggest, to the sort of campaigning we saw in Bennelong. But look, I thought there was a degree of refinement and separation by the two candidates themselves. John Alexander was being as gentlemanly as possible, and Christina Keneally actually, I thought, employed a strategy which did not directly criticise John Alexander very much at all. In fact, she was often drawing contrasts and saying he wouldn't say what Malcolm Turnbull just said. So as far as their own conduct is concerned, I thought it checked out okay. Were there some dirty tricks played around the edges? Well, there certainly were. We spoke about that letter earlier and questions of Chinese influence, almost impossible to investigate or validate. But these were the sorts of noises we heard around it. In the end, though, it doesn't seem to have upset the Liberal campaign too much on the numbers that we're seeing tonight.
It's one of those rare moments where both parties seem very happy with the result.
Yeah, you wouldn't think a defeat would unite a party like the Labor Party with the Liberal Party. They're not in any sense united. But look, some of these observations that are being made also, Bridget, about if this were to be mapped out nationally at a general election, it would mean the catastrophic collapse of the Turnbull government. In a way, some of those arguments are statements of the obvious, aren't they? We are talking about a parliament here. In fact, the whole night started with the proposition that this is a parliament where the government has but 76 seats. It had the possibility of falling to 75. So do your maths. 0.1% of a swing mapped out nationally is probably going to lead to the removal of the Turnbull government if in fact there was a national swing of that uniformity. Some of the margins in some of the seats are wafer thin heading into the next election, so rest assured not much needs to change for this government to fall and conversely for Labor to succeed potentially.
Okay. Greg, we'll come back to you, and you're watching our continuing coverage of the Bennelong by-election. The ABC's election analyst Anthony Green says on current counting, Liberal candidate John Alexander has won. There is a swing to Labor, but not enough for Christina Keneally, and we'll be bringing you up-to-the-minute details in results as they occur, as we wait for the candidates to address the gathered supporters and media. But now let's get some of the day's other news.
Hello, Nina Mairata with an ABC News update. 3 people have been taken to hospital with minor injuries after a Manly ferry and yacht collided near Fort Denison in Sydney Harbour. 2 people were thrown from this yacht during the collision with the Narrabeen about 2:30 this afternoon. It was towed into Rushcutters Bay with a broken mast and the ferry returned to Circular Quay. Police say it's too early in the investigation to say who was at fault.
Police are currently investigating the matter. Both the master of the yacht and the ferry were breath tested with a negative result.
There were 14 people on the yacht at the time. The Vatican has released a statement saying that the final report from the Child Abuse Royal Commission deserves to be studied seriously. It says the report is a result of what it calls accurate efforts made by the Commission. The Holy See says it remains committed to being close to Australia's Catholic Church as it makes efforts to bring healing and justice to the victims and survivors. Meanwhile, the recommendations on celibacy and confession have been widely rejected by senior Australian Catholics. A strong earthquake has struck off the coast of Java in Indonesia, killing at least 2 people. The magnitude 6.5 quake struck close to midnight local time, and it was felt 200 kilometres away in the capital, Jakarta. The powerful tremors lasted nearly 30 seconds in some areas, resulting in extensive damage to buildings in western Java. The US and North Korea have locked horns at the United Nations in a heated exchange over Pyongyang's nuclear program. The US Secretary of State says there should be no talks with North Korea until the rogue regime ceases its missile tests for a sustained period of time.
When North Korea tested its most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile last month, it raised the stakes in the bitter conflict with the United States and its allies. Today, for the first time in a decade, the American Secretary of State was eye-to-eye with Pyongyang's ambassador, and the tension was high.
They alone are responsible for these tensions. They alone must take responsibility for these tensions, and they alone can solve these tensions.
If anyone is to blame for it, the U.S. is the one who must be held accountable.
For Washington and its friends in the region, the prospect of nuclear war is untenable. But the risk is their attempts to deter North Korea will make a conflict more likely.
With a sense of urgency, we should make North Korea perceive without a doubt that it will pay heavily for its provocations.
The international community will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea.
Rex Tillerson had previously said there were no preconditions for talks with Pyongyang. But today he said negotiations can only start once North Korea stops testing missiles.
We are going to be prepared should something go wrong, and our military is prepared.
President Donald Trump raised North Korea with his Russian counterpart in a telephone conversation.
The primary point was to talk about North Korea, because we would love to have his help on North Korea. China's helping, Russia's not helping. We'd like to have Russia's help, very important.
And Mr. Trump again denied his campaign had sought Russian help to put him in the White House. Jonathan Flynn, ABC News.
South Australia says it's determined to weed out corruption interstate following claims of water theft from the Murray-Darling Basin. The state has released its draft terms of reference for its Royal Commission. There'll be a focus on identifying any water thieves and cover-ups.
The McBrides are among the biggest landowners in New South Wales. Today they ventured downstream as unlikely allies to South Australia in the fight over Murray-Darling water.
We do need a thorough investigation of what's happening now, because South Australia will die. The Murray River system will collapse.
Earlier this year, allegations emerged that billions of litres of water had been illegally pumped from the system and that some members of the New South Wales government knew about it. In response, South Australia last month announced it would establish a state-based Royal Commission after the federal government decided it would not. A top lawyer who recently represented Barnaby Joyce in the High Court will be appointed as Commissioner for the SA inquiry.
There are lots of allegations, there are lots of suggestions. What we need to know is the truth. And Brett Walker SC will get to the truth.
If that's happening in New South Wales, in the state there, what hope have we got of getting those flows down through here?
The Royal Commission will also look at whether the basin plan is on track to be delivered in full and what environmental impact any water theft may have had. Jay Weatherall says it would be in the other basin states' best interests to join in.
Once we get cogent findings of individual misbehaviour and the motivations for it, it will mean that the good people in those states, the good irrigators, the good bureaucrats, can use that to discipline those around them that are doing the wrong thing.
South Australia's river communities say any trust between the states has been broken, but they're hopeful it can be rebuilt.
By appointing an esteemed jurist such as Brett Walker, that's going to give everyone a level of confidence that there's enough independence.
The Royal Commission's expected to take about a year, with the final report due in February 2019. But the Commissioner has the option to deliver interim findings before then. Isabel Damon, ABC News, Loxton.
A memorial has been unveiled at the scene of the Lindt Cafe siege in 2014. The families of the two victims attended a memorial at Martin Place in Sydney on the 3rd anniversary of the deadly attack. Cafe manager Tori Johnson and barrister Katrina Dawson were killed when a lone gunman, Man Harun Monis, held 18 people hostage for 17 hours. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the events united the nation against terrorism.
No Australian will ever forget the heartbreaking events that unfolded in Martin Place 3 years ago, but none so more than the loved ones of Tori and Katrina, wonderful young Australians tragically killed by an act of evil and terror. Today we gather to honour Tori and Katrina. We gather to remember the way in which our city, our state and our nation came to get together in the days that followed, grief-stricken but defiant, shattered but united.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian there. And that is the latest news update from me. Now it's back to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Nina. And you're joining the ABC's coverage of the Bennelong by-election. In the studio with me is Labor's Tony Burke and Liberals' Trent Zimmerman. And Anthony Green has called the election to the Liberals' John Alexander, and we're going to go back now. Anthony, you're going to give us an update?
Just have a look at these polling places, the results that we're seeing. We've now got 67% of the vote counted. John Alexander's on 44%, Christina Kennedy 36%, 7% with the Greens, 4.6% with the Conservatives, 3.1% with the Christian Democrats, and the other 7 candidates have got 5% between them. When we look at the change in vote that's occurred since the last election, what we see on the change in vote since last election, the consistent figure there. Now, we've got a pre-poll vote in from West Ryde, and that's boosted that swing to the Labor Party. The Labor Party had a good result in the West Ryde pre-poll, but it's not having much impact on the overall two-candidate preferred at this stage, two-party preferred, if we look at the swing that's occurring there. It's a 4.8% swing. That will go up once that pre-poll is included, but it might come down once the postals are included on next week. And as we've said so far for the last hour or so, John Alexander has been re-elected as the member for Bennelong.
And what about the minor parties? We saw there, or the Cory Bernardi and the Christian Democrats there are swings to them? Maybe that's a question also.
That's part of one of the reasons why the swing hasn't been quite as big against the government, is that some of that loss has been to the Conservative parties, and it's all come back, strongly come back as preferences, and the Green vote is down, which has sort of worked against Labor in the after preferences count. So what does that mean? Well, I think the Green vote does tend to diminish. It's not one of their naturally strong areas. I'm not surprised their vote has fallen at a by-election. There were 2 polls showing the Conservatives on 7%, and they haven't got 7%, they got 4.5%. Is that a good result? Is it a bad result? I've always believed that there is a solid 5 to 7% of the vote for conservative Christian morals type parties, and it's quite solid for them. The difficulty for them is trying to get beyond that. It may be that the party is making inroads into the Liberal Party membership, but as people from both political parties know, their membership is further away from the centre of Australian politics than the voters as a whole. So a lot of applause from within Liberal Party branches may not actually be well reflected in the electorate, because the electorate is different from Liberal Party members.
Some of the swings were predicting a swing of 9% to Labor. It's only 5%.
Yeah, so can I just follow up on that minor party vote,
sure.
if I may? Part of the reduction in the Greens vote is probably countered by part of our improvement in our primary vote. You can't presume that all our primary voters come directly off the Liberal poll. A lot of it has, the majority of it has, but some of that is probably straight off the Green poll. So the preference issue there is of less concern in terms of the final two-party preferred outcome. The other thing that has changed today, though, is from the figures that I've seen, Cory Bernardi's capacity to hold preferences.
We need to go, I think we're going to go to some live pictures. Sorry to interrupt. Of Labor, of Christina Keneally. She's arriving with Bill Shorten. And we're just watching her walk in. Okay. We'll just, we'll come. We're just having some issues with the feed, but we're going to stay on that. You can hear a bit of cheering there, so, you know, as you said, Tony Burke, they're happy. Trent, you'll say it's a spin, and then when we go to the Liberals, you'll say they haven't done as well as what they should have.
Well, I think this was a test for Bill Shorten, and he's been found wanting. He predicted that he would win this seat. He predicted that the mood of the nation was strongly in favour of throwing this government out, and it hasn't happened. And his next test will be Batman, and if he doesn't hold on to Batman with a sitting member recontesting, which seems to be the barometer for Tony, then you've got 2 strikes. I wonder what the third will be.
Do you know that a lot of people watching tonight are thinking, oh, more by-elections? When's it going to be over? Anyway, let's go back to the Liberal headquarters where Stephen Jedgetts is there with Craig Kelly MP.
Well, hi, Bridget. As you said, I'm here with Liberal MP from Sydney, Craig Kelly. Craig, what do you make of tonight's result? Is it a good one or a bad one?
Well, I think it's reflected by the mood of this room. If you look around this room, it's packed with people with John Alexander T-shirts on, and they are celebrating. They're celebrating loudly. This is a very good win for John. He'll be back in Parliament. I think that's a fantastic result. And more importantly, I think the result was actually better than all the opinion polls have picked.
That's true, but at the same time, you're looking at a swing of some 5% against you. That's enough to cost you government if it's replicated at the next election. Is that not a cause of concern?
Oh, look, it is. We have to. Let's not get overly excited amongst the buoyancy of the room.
No, we've got a problem there. Let's see if we can go back to Christina Keneally. No.
And everything but the kitchen
no, that's
sink.
okay. We
so
will go to
always
Christina Keneally, who is addressing...
I think 5% is a pretty good result.
We'll leave it at that. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks.
It just dropped out in the very last bit, guys, apparently. The signal dropped.
Yes, it did.
They just lost the very end of that. Thanks.
That's okay. We'll come back there. We understand that John Alexander will be there in about 20 minutes. But let's go now to Labor, where Christina Keneally is addressing.
But I am here tonight to claim success for the Labor movement, right? It seems like we're going to achieve about 5.5 5.5 to 6% swing to the Labour Party. That is in a safe Liberal seat. Let's just understand what this means. If this result was replicated at a general election, we would see 24 to 28 seats. Bring it on! That would mean a Labour government, and it would mean Bill Shorten as our Prime campaign, it was going to be hard. I said when we went into this that we were the underdogs. We needed to achieve a 10% swing. We needed to get 9,000 people to change their votes from how they voted just a year ago. That is a huge ask in a 32-day campaign. Now, that's a big fight, but it is a fight worth having. It is a fight worth having because it is worth to stand up to protect Medicare. It is worth it to stand up. To fight against the cuts to our schools, and it is worth it to stand up and say we deserve a better NBN. I just want to say a giant thank you to the 4,000 volunteers. They were part of this Bennelong by-election campaign. They stood in the searing heat hours on end at pre-poll, as we do. More than 13,000 people cast their vote early in this by-election, and they were greeted by a sea of red as they came to the polling booths. Our volunteers, they knocked on doors. They knocked on some 50,000 doors in 32 days. That's it. They gave up their nights and their weekends to poll voters. In fact, we called voters with our phones plugged in, did we not? With 60,000 people. How extraordinary. And today, more than 1,000 volunteers stood on the booths to talk to voters. I am so proud of our incredible volunteers from the bottom of my heart. And can I say a giant thank you to Young Labour. The Bennelong Bandits. You didn't know I called yourself that, but I knew you did. Well done, well done. To our rank and file Labour members, and particularly to all of those people who just worked so hard, and include in that the Labour Mayor of Ryde, Jerome Lexell. Thank you. I also want to thank our hardworking volunteers from the mighty trade union movement. I particularly acknowledge Unions New South Wales and Mark Murray, the ACTU and Sally McManus. It was so fantastic. Your pursuit of fighting for fairness for working people is tremendous, and I honor it. Most importantly, though, tonight, if you'll allow me, I want to thank my husband, Ben. He's a good guy. My sons, Daniel and Brendan. I have to say, 32 days ago, I don't think any of us in the Keneally household thought we were going to be shoved into perhaps one of the most hotly contested by-election campaigns in Australian history. And I want to thank my family for their patience again. Stands in a stark contrast to that run by our opponents. Our campaign was powered by real people having real conversations about real issues that mattered to the families in Bennelong. It's extraordinary how the Liberals, having been in government for 4 years, with a Prime Minister who's been in government for 2 years, could not come here and talk about the positive things that they want to do for this community. The reality is they came with no hope, no plans, only division, only fear. When we started this campaign, I said that this by-election was a chance for the people of Bennelong to
Okay. Oh. That's a shame. Look, just while we're waiting for that feed to come back, I've been told that the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, is heading his way to the Liberal headquarters. I know that John Alexander's due there in about another 15 minutes. But let's go to Tony Burke. Christina Keneally, she looked pretty excited there for someone who didn't win.
She's been a great candidate. There's no doubt about that. And she's been, I think, completely civil to John Alexander on the way through. And it hasn't mattered what was thrown at her. Christina has kept just a calm, positive, energetic demeanour. And, you know, you don't get that number of volunteers turning up for just anyone. It doesn't happen automatically. And it's a real credit to what Christina's been able to do as a candidate.
She knows what it's like to run a campaign with an election really, really against them because, you know, when she was Premier in 2011, it was a pretty hard campaign. Yeah. Trent Zimmerman, what do you...
Well, I think
happy.
from what we've seen so far, we've seen a classic case of how you spin an unsavoury sandwich to make it look tasty. And today we saw on every polling booth posters saying send Malcolm Turnbull a message from the Labor Party, and they have sent him a message, and that's that they wanted John Alexander back and they didn't want to risk the government's majority. So I think it's been quite a strong and clear result for the party, and I think it's been a bad result for Bill Shorten today. So I'm not quite sure. I understand that post an election you go through the 7 stages of grieving. We've all been there. I think that Christina's still in the denial stage, but it is trying very hard to claim this as a positive outcome.
OK, I think we can go back to Christina Keneally.
And to fight again. Absolutely. We will be called upon. And given the spirit and the unity that we have seen in this campaign, there is no one in Australia tonight who doubts our strength and our determination. There will be millions of Australians who want to have their say on Malcolm Turnbull and his lousy government. And what I say to them is you have a choice. You have a choice at the next general election. You have a choice to have a Prime Minister who cares for the vulnerable, who stands up and fights for working people, who is a man who knows who he is, comfortable in his skin, and fights for what is right and for what is fair. Absolutely. He is a great friend of mine. He has been a tremendous support on this campaign, and he is the next Prime Minister of Australia.
Christina may not have won the election tonight, but she and you and the voters of Bennelong have given Labor an election-winning swing at the next election. Well done. I want to thank Christina and Ben and her family for stepping up. 35 days ago, this was not a prospect. And I salute a most remarkable candidate who has secured Labor a most remarkable swing. And I want to acknowledge the work of our General Secretary, Kayla Murnane. And to complete the local trifecta, you have got one of the best mayors in Australia to run this now. Friends, this was not an ordinary by-election. Normally in a by-election, the former member doesn't run again. So therefore, we enjoy the benefit in the swing of perhaps the lessening of their personal vote. So I congratulate John Alexander, but what I recognise is that because he was running again, this 5.5% to 6% two-party preferred vote, I think a swing over 7% will end up, or near 7% on primaries. That entire swing is attributable to Malcolm Turnbull and his rotten policies for this country.
My friend Mr Turnbull loves to be quoted, loves to quote himself, so I will do him the favour of quoting him. He said that this was a poll on him and his government. Malcolm Turnbull, you are correct. It was. I want to thank all of the volunteers and all of the participants. If Labor could replicate this swing, which was accomplished by all of you, led by Christina in Bennelong, I have no doubt that after the next general election, Labor will form a government and something like 24 to 28 government seats will fall, and we will make this country a country which is governed in the interests of the middle and working class, not the top end of town. Friends, Labor finishes 2017 with the most remarkable wind in its sails, not the least because of the effort of people in this room, and I thank you, and I promise you in 2018, and I make this promise to the Australian people, Labor will present positive policies. We will present policies which speak to the lives, the cost of living, the energy prices, the schools, the Medicare needs of Australians. And I promise in 2018 it will be a year of courage, because the Australian people want courage from the Labor Party, and I promise you, using tonight's example, we will be courageous and we will stand up and we will put people first. Thank you very much.
Let's come back. There's Bill Shorten and Christina Keneally at the Labor headquarters there in Ryde. Tony Burke, also very excited for not winning.
Well, you can't get around the fact that this is a different by-election to any other, and that sort of swing is much more than you need to change the government. Much more than you need to change the government. So at the end of a hard campaign with a great candidate, Bill is understandably pretty happy. We'd be at another level of happy if we got over the line and won the seat. But this is a sort of result where you look at what it would mean nationally, and it's extraordinary.
Trent, though, for you, it's Labor have done badly.
Well, I think that Bill's approach, as we've seen tonight, is purely delusional. He set this up as a test for him and for the government's popularity. He said that they would win the seat of Bennelong and that Christina Keneally would be the next member for Bennelong. He has failed that test, and the people of Bennelong have re-elected John Alexander as a member of Malcolm Turnbull's government. And I want to make the point that in the figures that we've seen so far, we don't have the approximately 20% of those who've cast a formal vote with a postal vote actually counted yet. So the swing will actually come down once that has happened. So I think that the government, yes, needs to listen to any messages that have come out from Bennelong, but can certainly take great comfort that we've had a great local member in John Alexander, but also that the people of Bennelong did not accept the scare campaign that Labor tried to run. It did not accept that this government should lose its majority in the parliament.
I think one of the most telling things we just saw, and I understand we've got the satellite connection for when we go to the Liberal Party, but what we've just watched, as I understand it, was a feed coming through the NBN. And it wasn't very good, was it?
Well, we know that...
It really wasn't very good. It kept stopping and halting and buffering, and that says as much about the campaign as the speeches.
Well, I don't think we actually do know it was over at the NBN, but we also know that Chris Pine's over there with Sky.
Well, it wasn't by carrier pigeon.
I suspect Chris Pine was probably pulling the plug out during that broadcast. So.
OK, let's leave the NBN out of this. Let's go to Greg Jennett again in Canberra. Greg Jennett, if you're still there, once again, both of these guys are really happy. But look, it must be said that Malcolm Turnbull, we know he's on his way. Now, you'll be able to take us through. It's been a pretty tough year for Malcolm Turnbull. So for him to be able to pull this off, you know, reasonably easily, it means that he can certainly rest at home and not be concerned about his leadership.
Look, a win's a win in anyone's books, Bridget, so I don't think the Prime Minister will be second-guessing the magnitude of swings, nor worrying too much about the rhetoric in Christina Keneally's speech, nor in Bill Shorten's. So he will take the victory and the the fact that he's now back at 76 seats in the House of Representatives. At least that's the way we're going to start in 2018. But yes, the point you make is the obvious one. It's been a difficult year in which intractable issues have had to be resolved. So one of them was same-sex marriage. We've had the pall of citizenship doubts hanging over most of the Parliament for most of the year, certainly for more than 6 months of it, and that will also lay over into 2018 as well. Budget management is still an ongoing issue despite strong growth in employment. There's still pressure on the budget. I guess we'll see the next instalment of that in the mid-year economic update still to come. And constant insurgencies, I suppose you would say, from conservative flanks within the coalition, on the backbench in particular. Now, some of that may have started to rectify itself. There certainly was a slightly different mood in the last sitting week of the Parliament because Barnaby Joyce came back on the scene very much in the latter half of that week, and immediately some discipline seemed to be restored as we limp towards the end of the parliamentary year. So the rhetoric will cancel itself out a bit tonight. Both the Prime Minister's and Christina Keneally's and Bill Shorten's, they all have different messages they need to project to different audiences. You could certainly observe, couldn't you, that Christina Keneally's done a bit of this before. Not many losing candidates can pull off a rousing rah-rah speech of that tone on such an occasion, but she's got the wherewithal to be able to do it. And then, I suppose, to go off and reassess what it is about her political career that lies next. Is it the resurrection of one, or does she return to media employment, which she was doing before the by-election came along? Just finally, Bridget, just on the numbers there are great dangers clearly in trying to transpose a by-election result uniformly nationally across the country. And just to underscore that, both primary votes here tonight in Bennelong are up, and in some cases up above what the national vote is that was achieved by either party. So the Liberal Party tonight, 44%. That sits above their national vote of 42% at the last general election. So too with Labor, now pulling 36% in Bennelong as against 34.7% at the last general election. So just as you reflect on those numbers, always be aware that once Labor's getting in the mid-30s, it's nip and tuck whether they're ever really going to be able to pull across the line. So 36 is respectable there, but if you wanted to take that and say, would it win you an election nationally, it'd be a very tight-run thing, and once again would rely on Greens' preferences.
OK, Greg Jennett, thank you very much for being the voice of reason right throughout the evening. And Tony Burke, did you just hear what he said about
the mathematics of that was bizarre. The mathematics of that was completely bizarre because, well, you can't say, oh, Labor only got, 36% primary vote.
Hang on,
what's that?
We've got to let him defend himself. Can we get
the point is just if we're going to take one seat's results, and I was just taking the primary results and say what would they mean nationally, well, if you wanted to do it, I'm not saying it's a statistically valid thing to do at all, but if you did, you've got 36% and 44%.
The swing is statistically valid. If you want to talk about the swing for each party on their primary vote and the two-party preferred, that's valid. But to just take the raw number and say Labor can only get 36% in a seat that was 9% on the pendulum, therefore they can't get there, that doesn't add up.
OK,
can I just say...
Firstly, sorry, Trent, I want to bring in Anthony. You'll know this. Who's right and who's wrong here?
I think it's pointless discussing the by-election. I think what's more relevant is actually the national polls, and there has been a national poll for a very long time which shows the government re-elected. And I think that national percentage is more reliable. By-elections, it may be bigger, it may be smaller, the next general election. The swing in this by-election was slightly bigger than what you normally see, than the national swing we're seeing in opinion polls. The rule of thumb is usually that a by-election swing will be twice whatever the national polls are. That may be the John Alexander factor, there may be a number of reasons. But if you're trying to talk about the future of the government, I know everyone wants to use the by-election, but I think the national polls are far more important.
Okay.
But can I just make the point, though?
Yes.
And I know that Tony and Bill Shorten are desperately trying to secure some type of win out of tonight's proceedings. But the fact of the matter is that trying to extrapolate the results of Bennelong in terms of a national vote would be as sensible as trying to extrapolate the results of New England on a national vote, which of course would show that if that was extrapolated, the Labor Party would be wiped out across the country. What is, I think, amazing is that you've had a Prime Minister in the space of 3 months who's won very convincingly 2 very different by-elections, one in rural Australia and one in urban metropolitan Australia. And I think we can take great satisfaction from that.
This goes to the speech that the Prime Minister will soon give, because effectively he has a choice right now. If he wants to send a message to the Australian people that he is listening, he would send a message acknowledging the swing and saying that, you know, we've heard the message. If he wants to send a message to his party room, it'll be a speech of complete jubilation. Now, I don't know which way he'll go, but that is the option that he's got in a few minutes' time. Is it a speech to the Australian people trying to win them back, or is the bigger threat making sure that the party room is convinced that everything's going perfectly?
Well, we will cross to Malcolm Turnbull shortly, and we'll see if you're
But
right.
I think that the voters in Bennelong have recognised today in re-electing John Alexander in a contest which, as Tony says, was about whether the government would maintain its majority in the parliament. They've recognised that despite all of the distractions and all the furor over the constitutional issues surrounding members of parliament, that this is a government that is performing exceptionally strongly. And just in the last 2 weeks of this parliament, we've been able to mark an important social reform, but also, more importantly for so many Australians, mark what are exceptional job growth figures, which have seen job growth figures of something like 1,000 jobs a day over the course of the year, 380,000 jobs created just in the last 12 months. And when you come to the issues that people are most concerned about, there is none more important than having a strong economy where we're seeing jobs actually growing. And I think that that's reflected in today's result.
OK, let's go back to Anthony Green. You've got some final figures?
Yes, I've got the final figures. We've got, what's said, 37 of 39 counting centres. All that's outstanding is 2 very blind and low vision. And
the postal votes.
The postal votes are still to come. But in terms of what's coming tonight, this is basically the final figures for tonight, which is 73.3% counted. John Alexander on 44.1, Christina Keneally on 36.3. 6.9 with the Greens, 4.5 with the Conservatives, 3.2 with the Christian Democrats. If we look at the change in first preference vote, this, as I said, this is basically everything counted. Liberals down 6.2, Labor up 7.6, the Greens down, the overall Conservative vote up, and that's produced a bit of a shift in the way the preferences flown at this election. Let's look at the two-party preferred swing that's going on in this electorate, and what we're seeing here. We're seeing a swing of, I think it's 5.6% there, 54.1. That's gone up with the addition of the pre-poll votes. So it does appear that the Labor Party have done better on the pre-poll votes, but then you would expect that there are no absent votes at this election, so that changes the composition of the pre-polls. And John Alexander has been re-elected as a member for Bennelong.
We were talking earlier before about the minor parties, and we saw on the graphics there Cory Bernardi and the Christian Democrats, and you were talking about the influence of the Cory Bernardi party. What does this mean nationally? Yeah,
what we're seeing by the look of that is the old Fred Nile vote is starting to shift across to Cory Bernardi's party, and it's also the case that Cory Bernardi appears able to hold his preferences even more strongly than Fred Nile was ever able to hold his. Now,
yeah, but the Christian Democrats it's only at 3%.
That's right, that's right.
Cory Bernardi party, though, they were predicting much more than a 4.5%.
I think they were hoping for 20%.
Wow.
Well, what they have is enough now, and given the biggest story of them tonight, I believe, is how strongly they have held their preference flows. Now, that means Cory Bernardi, in being able to negotiate with the government in the lead up to the next election, has put himself, as of tonight, in a very powerful position. I'm not madly happy about that, but that's what those numbers say.
Do you agree?
I think having stood next to Conservative Party volunteers today and during the last couple of weeks, what they were doing was selling a message, which was you can have John Alexander back, but you can send a message if you've got something you're unhappy with. So they were actually saying to voters at the polling booths that I was at that vote 1 for the Conservatives, but vote 2 for John Alexander, and you get to make sure that that the government's majority is protected. And I think that that's a message that obviously resonated with some people. But we saw tonight about, I think, 90% of preferences flowing from the Conservatives to us. The Christian Democrats in Bennelong last time it was about 80%. So yes, it is a lift, but you are essentially talking about votes as part of the broader Liberal family, and they're staying within that family.
And
just as Green votes generally flow back to Labor.
And the same-sex, I know we talked about it before, but the figures are in the same-sex marriage vote in Bennelong. You know, this was the electorate, more than half voted no.
It was 50-50.
Yeah, it was just slightly, wasn't it? Like 51-49 or something. But so has that had a significant, uplift possibly for those?
Look, it may have helped
parties.
with those parties a bit. I think a lot of people view that issue as something that had now been dealt with. Like in terms of the by-election, there was going to be no vote in the Parliament as a result of the by-election. It had already happened, so I'd be surprised if that factored in.
And I think that because of the postal survey, anyone who opposed same-sex marriage had to even begrudgingly accept that this was the Parliament acting in accordance with the wishes of the Australian people. So it's pretty hard to take a dim view of the Prime Minister for doing what voters said they wanted to happen.
Greg Jennett in Canberra, back to our Canberra bureau. Greg Jennett, what do you think about Cory Bernardi's influence now nationally and what Tony Burke and Trent Zimmerman have been talking about?
No, I agree completely with what Tony Burke's saying there, Bridget.
Yes, I'm clipping that.
What was his nickname? The Burke thesis?
Don't disagree on everything.
Have you thought of one for Anthony? He doesn't need one. Anthony doesn't need a nickname.
No, he's just the Oracle, I think. But no, the Liberals have never really been able to find an erstwhile ally who could reliably deliver to them preferences that stick and hold. Now, if Cory Bernardi's movement is that thing, then the government will have to try and formalise that, lock it in some way so that it can reliably bank on those preferences coming towards it. Now, how you do that can be a hellishly complicated negotiation, I suppose, because Cory Bernardi, in return for some sort of preferencing arrangement, would obviously be trying to advance the interests of his own party, and one would have to imagine principally in the Senate. So they'd be the sort of negotiations they'd be trying to enter into. And there are limited numbers of seats where the Conservatives' vote will be as high as it is in Bennelong. By that I mean certainly multiple handfuls, a couple of dozen even, but not necessarily anything like 100 seats. Nevertheless, the Liberals will want to harvest as much as they can from that grouping and have it come back to them. At what cost? Well, we'd have to see how Senate arrangements work. They're getting harder to actually make deals in the Senate now that the electoral laws have changed at last year's election in 2016, but to the extent that they can be directed, I think Cory Bernardi would probably be willing to sit down with the government and enter that negotiation. The other thing, Bridget, just finally, is some people were observing after the New England electorate that there may have been a bit of a sympathy factor around citizenship at work for Barnaby Joyce there. I'm just wondering, as tonight comes to a close, whether this is a phenomenon, apart from the fact that he's a sitting MP seeking re-election, which is unusual, whether in fact John Alexander might have been the beneficiary of some sort of sympathy vote, that which goes along the lines of, we feel sorry for you because you've been caught out on a technicality. Now, I know politicians will argue whether it's a technicality. I just think some members of the public see some of this citizenship stuff as rather highfalutin, technical, constitutional stuff about which they don't care.
Yeah, Greg, I think we're just going to go to some pictures at Liberal Party headquarters. We've been told the Prime Minister's arriving. We'll just stay on that. We'll stay on that picture. Interestingly, what Greg Jennett was talking about there, about the sympathy vote, because it was seen that he's lost on a had to get out on a technicality. Do you think that's correct?
It's definitely a view that's out there.
Yeah.
Definitely
Do you think there's a bit of that, both of you?
Yeah, it's not a view I agree with, but that in terms of that being a view in the Australian public, it's quite strong.
Yeah, and I think it is rolled in with the fact that John Alexander is a very popular local figure, and people didn't want to lose him, and they didn't particularly want to lose him because of a section of the Constitution that before this year they'd never heard of.
We've just lost the shot. It has nothing to do with the NBN, but we will come back to that.
Tony, would you like to apologise?
No, you've got the satellite for the Liberal. We got the NBN for the Labor. Yeah.
Now, as I mentioned before, there's lots of people sitting at home. We're all waiting for the Prime Minister and John Alexander, and they're thinking, oh, good, all this talk of citizenship's over. You know, no more High Court, but it's certainly not over.
No, it'll
What's 2018? What's going to happen? But you don't have the numbers now to get the, the 9 referrals.
This is the really interesting thing, and it is a big question for the Prime Minister now. Will he use his majority to... There's a number of people who have been in black and white situations, and they've always been self-referred. There's a number of people where there is grey, where one side of politics thinks they have a problem and the other side of politics doesn't. Will he use this majority to only refer the Labor members? Now, I don't know if he'll do that. I hope we don't do that, because in terms of precedent, it's something the House of Representatives has never done in the past. But that is a very real question for the Prime Minister of Australia.
So if he's going to refer Labor, he has to refer his own. It's got to be.
It has always been the case that a majority government has not used that majority to kick members of Parliament out.
The government doesn't kick members of Parliament. The High Court would.
But to do anything that's on that path, to use the majority in a hostile way, has never been done. It's never even happened in the Senate, where opposition sometimes would be able to cobble the numbers together to do it. But if that step is taken, whether you agree with the step being taken or not, it is a fundamental change in how we've operated.
Well, I think the point is that type of convention works when you're confident that the other political party is going to respond genuinely and fairly to problems that are raised, and we haven't seen that to date.
So I moved David Feeney.
And that's the only one you've moved, when there are quite clearly issues in relation to some of your other members. And what we've seen is now three coalition members do the right thing, either resign or refer themselves, actually all resign or refer themselves to the High Court. But you haven't seen that happening on the Labor Party side. And you've had one case now after the member themselves have basically admitted they're in serious trouble. But in contrast, it's sort of become this thing, well, we'll nominate ours if you nominate some of yours, and they've tried to put through the Parliament cases which are palpably ridiculous. So, for example, they wanted to do something with Josh Frydenberg, only pulled back at the last minute. They wanted to do something with Alex Hawke.
Josh Frydenberg was never on a resolution.
Until Michael Danby intervened.
No, sorry, fundamentally wrong. Fundamentally wrong, and I'll just call you up on that. Fundamentally wrong. I wrote the motion. I moved the motion. He was never on the list.
Well, someone on your own side was spinning.
So we're looking at pictures of the Bennelong by-election. I do have to say that sitting here, this is part of the problem, that this back and forward of all these different names and who's going to refer who and who isn't going to refer to the High Court. Don't you think that people in the electorate are sitting listening to this thinking, oh, they're still on about it? Like, isn't that a fundamental problem for both parties?
And they want us to sit down and sort it out.
We want all of this to go away. No one feels it more than those of us sitting in that chamber, but we want to get it sorted out.
I know, but then anyway, how are you going to sort it out? Like, what do you think Malcolm Turnbull's going to do, Trent Zimmerman? Will he refer all
I think that where there is a substantial case that the High Court needs to resolve, then the Parliament will refer those people.
Joseph Zielinski?
Well, I don't believe there is a substantial case in relation to Joseph Zielinski.
Oh my goodness. Now...
But this is how ridiculous it is. I mean, Labor tried to refer Alex Hawke, who has confirmation from the Greek government that he is not a citizen of Greece, in writing. That's how rigorous the process was.
Wouldn't it be better off for everyone, given that both of you just get together and talk it out and say, right, we'll just refer all of them?
That was the invitation that we did put out, and the Prime Minister decided that he believed all of his were okay and didn't want to do it. So that was when I moved for both sides to be referred.
And if you're in his situation too in government and you're going to lose it, you'd probably do the same as Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, he might do something different now that this one's sorted.
I think we've got the
and John Alexander.
member for Bennelong.
Yeah.
And I just say while we're watching, I see Chris Stone, our State Director, there, and I do want to congratulate Chris and also Andrew Hurst, our Federal Director, his first test as Federal Director in a campaign sense. And I think after tonight both will be very happy men, and they deserve to be after what's been a hard-fought and difficult campaign.
Yeah, Malcolm Turnbull's looking very relieved. Trent and Tony Burke still arguing.
In good humour.
And Anthony, what were you going to say?
Just on the swing, Labor Party didn't put much of an effort in last time as well, which must also be said as well, of course, is the swing.
Can we keep talking? We'll just. I think they're about to give their acceptance speech. We might go back to this. Firstly, you wanted to say.
I just wanted to congratulate John Alexander.
From Tony Burke.
Yeah.
Here's the Prime Minister. They both look very, very happy.
Thank you, Bennelong. Thank you to the people of Bennelong. The people of Bennelong who put their faith in this man. This man, John Alexander. This guy at the Eastwood Public School today. A lady came up to us as we were canvassing there and she said, John Alexander is an honest man. He's a hard-working man. He has served us for many years. He is a good man. He is my choice today. And that's what thousands of people have said. And John, I tell you, John was there with me at the end of a long campaign. I thought you were going to burst into tears. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for all of the extraordinary work that's been done. Thank you, Andrew Hurst and Chris Stone. Thank you for the amazing leadership. Thank you for the thousands of volunteers. What an amazing Blue Army we've seen across Bennelong today. In huge numbers. Huge numbers. Liberals have come from across the state, across the nation. We've had Nationals with us campaigning here just as Liberals campaigned for Barnaby in New England. A great coalition. And John Alexander had everything thrown at him. Every lie that Labor could dream up was thrown at him. But John, as always, was straight and true and honest, and he stuck to our principles and our policies, and he talked about the 1,000 jobs a day we're creating in Australia. He talked about the $75 billion of infrastructure we're building. He talked about the work he is doing for the people of Bennelong, and he said to them, I have been your champion, now let me be your champion again. And John, they have said, yes, John Alexander, you are Bennelong's champion, just as you have been Australia's champion. And tonight, John, this is your night. The hero of the hour, John Alexander, winning yet another great title. Member for Bennelong, once again, your hero, my friend, our distinguished colleague and champion, John Alexander.
Firstly, thank you, Malcolm, for all your support. And I was just... this is an extraordinary moment for us. There's the last 4 or 5 weeks have been a tumultuous time. And it's been a real battle. I think there's many positives to take from this, but firstly, I think I've got to say to the people of Bennelong that it has been regrettable that we had to go through this experience, that we had to have a by-election. On the positive side, with all of the volunteers here and your incredible support, with the support of my colleagues, with the support of Mitch, who I see there, who caught my eye, who in 2010 we door-knocked 10,000 homes, and that was really the basis of our winning Bennelong. And Connie there, another one of our great door-knockers. But more than anything else, the experience over the last 5 weeks, I felt as every single colleague that I've ever known, and I said the best thing of becoming a Member of Parliament was that I had all these new friends. At an age of 59, you don't make a lot of friends. And they were friends who I appreciated as being people with ideals, people who had given public service to try to make Australia a better place, to concentrate on the development of policies that would serve our people best. And this event over the last 5 weeks, I think, under Malcolm, has brought us together. It's been the most unifying and humbling experience. And I think that Malcolm would agree that we had something like 800 volunteers working today, and which makes us just two of 800, and that's how it is. We were a team where every single person is so valued, so appreciated, and just thank you so much. Thank you also to the people of Bennelong who the funny conversations you have. A guy came up today and he was in work clothes. He excused himself. He said, "Malcolm, could I still have a photograph? I'm in my work clothes." He's a landscape gardener, and he'd worked with George Paulby to build Tennis World in 1979, and they'd come over to Atlanta to look at our club, and that was the beginning of Tennis World. Yeah. And I then got to what I thought my tennis career was finished because I hurt my back. I started coaching there at one point, and then the back got better, and I was actually eligible for the disabled sticker on my car, and then I got to about number 14 in the world, and the doctor at the time said, you have eligibility for a disabled sticker. I said, I still have some pride. That was before I entered politics. But, sorry, I digress. But the overwhelming feeling, and we feel it tonight, is that there is an incredible moment of elation. And it's very, very similar to when you're selected to represent your country in sport. But the immediate reaction that you have after that moment of elation is that you have a responsibility. And that's a responsibility to do your absolute best under Malcolm for the people of Australia and for me, for the people of Bennelong. So again, thank you so much. Thank you. So, and finally, those who suffer most. Deb, who has to put up with me at the end of tiring days, thank you so much. To my beautiful daughters who are here, Emily and Georgia, and my sister Annette, who's a real party rager. Where is Annette? Yeah. You'll be safe driving home, I know. Annette is who I shack up with in Canberra. And tongues were waggling when she came to have lunch with me one day, and I luxuriated in that. Thank you, Annette, who also threw the first ball to me, trying to teach me how to play tennis once. And most of all, thank you, every single one of you. Thank you so much. And Malcolm, this is a renaissance of your leadership. We're going to go...
It isn't a general election, it is just a by-election. I think it's safe to say that the Prime Minister looks more excited here than the candidate, John Alexander. Trent Zimmerman, a great victory for John Alexander and Malcolm Turnbull.
It is a great night for both the Prime Minister and John Alexander, and I think we've seen tonight what a gracious, humble and down-to-earth guy John Alexander is, and I think that's why he's so popular in his electorate. And he never has taken his feet off the ground in politics. But can I say, he mentioned that he was number 14 in the world for tennis. Tonight he's number 1 in the world for Australian politics, and I'm just so grateful for the campaign that he's run. And can I also say that the campaign's been supported by all of those volunteers we see tonight, but I did particularly want to acknowledge our Federal Director, Andrew Hurst, who went through his first electoral challenge in this by-election, and Chris Stone, our State Director, who's done an amazing job. And to all of them, and most importantly of all, to the people of Bennelong, I know that John Alexander won't let you down.
Just briefly, Tony Burke.
Well, congratulations to John Alexander. Congratulations. And he is liked by both sides of the chamber. He's a good person, while I would have wanted a different outcome in tonight's by-election. No matter how much of a long shot I wanted it. People wish him well, and well done to him. Yep. In terms of receiving a message, I'm not sure that the PM has.
That's for tomorrow. Anthony, a quick recap.
Look, basically the swings above up. I'm not sure if we're getting graphics or not. Thanks, Zoe. John Alexander, at the end of the night, we got the one last polling place that came in, which is a small pre-poll centre, 44.1 to 36.3 votes there for the other parties. You can see, look at the change in first preference vote that's occurred. 6% down for the Liberal Party, 7.6 up for the Labor Party. Those other parties changing there. Let's look at the swing that's occurred, the two candidate preferred swing. It's gone up to 5.6% once we included the pre-polls. And when we look at as I said on this last graphic, we'll just show John Alexander re-elected as the member for Bennelong.
Anthony, thanks very much. And that's the latest from ABC News. I'm Bridget Glanville. Thanks for your company. Firstly, also a special thank you to Greg Janet in Canberra for your voice of reason, I should say, and your nicknames.
Yes, no, thanks, Bridget. Look, just quickly to recap here, the renaissance of the Prime Minister's leadership, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But what you can certainly observe from that moment there in Sydney tonight was the Prime Minister was making up for lost opportunities. My mind went back to that lonely Saturday night on July 2 last year at the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney, where Malcolm Turnbull was unable to deliver the victor's speech that he had wanted to. I think he was making up for that in some senses with his exuberance and enthusiasm that we saw in Bennelong tonight.
Greg Jenner, thank you very much for your analysis. I appreciate it. And thanks for your company. And a special thank you, of course, to Anthony Green, the ABC election analyst, to Tony Burke and to Trent Zimmerman for your knowledge and insight and for not getting into a...
We've been pretty civil.
No, they've been very good. It's been lots of fun. So stay with us. 1+1 is next, and that's it for our special coverage of the Bennelong. Oh, sorry, it's not 1+1. Insiders is coming out. Oh, my mistake. What I meant to say is Tony Burke
I'm on Insiders
is going to be on Insiders.
I'm happy to do it immediately if it means I don't have to be back here in the morning.
Yeah, that's right. In less than 12 hours, Tony Burke will be back here. So thank you once again. And well done to you, seeing as it's apparently a win for both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, and that's it tonight. Thanks for your company. Have a very good night.